The morning they handed Mara Veyne to a stranger, like she was livestock nobody wanted, her own uncle laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed laugh. A real one, loud, from the belly, the kind a man lets out when he thinks something is genuinely funny. The barren one goes to the cowboy, Silas Braddock announced to the room, and the men around the table chuckled like it was the punchline of a joke they'd been waiting years to hear. Mara stood in the doorway of her dead father's study, still wearing the dress she'd slept in, and she understood in that exact moment that she had never been a person to these men. She had been a problem, and now she was somebody else's. What none of them understood, not Braddock, not the laughing men, not the quiet cowboy sitting alone at the end of the table, was that handing Mara Veyne to Rhett Calder was the single worst decision Silas Braddock would ever make in his life. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where the people everyone wrote off refused to stay written off, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And if you feel something before we're done here, give it a like. Now let's go back to where it all began. The summer Mara Veyne turned 23, three things happened in quick succession. Her father died in April. The bank sent its first serious letter in May. And in June, on the hottest morning anyone in Cinder Hollow could remember, her uncle Silas Braddock called what he described as a family meeting, though Mara would later say it was the least family-like gathering she had ever witnessed in her life. She almost didn't go. She'd been up since before dawn, the way she always was now, because the ranch didn't care that she was grieving and exhausted and had spent the previous night sitting at the kitchen table staring at numbers that refused to cooperate no matter how many times she added them. The cattle needed water. The windmill needed a part she couldn't afford. One of the fence lines along the east pasture had collapsed overnight, and three of her remaining cows had wandered through the gap and were now somewhere she hadn't located yet. That was her morning before 7 a.m. So when her uncle's man, a thick-necked fellow named Dolan, who always smelled faintly of tobacco and something sour, arrived at her door with word that Braddock wanted to see her at the big house by 9, Mara's first instinct was to tell him she was busy. She didn't, because even through her exhaustion, she understood that refusing Silas Braddock's invitations was its own kind of problem, and she already had enough of those. She washed her face, changed her dress, braided her hair the quick way her mother had taught her. 3 seconds, done, and rode the 4 miles to Blackthorn Range on a horse that needed new shoes and knew it. The big house was already full when she arrived. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Her uncle's study was a room that seated perhaps 8 people comfortably. On this particular morning, there were 14 men crowded into it, and Mara recognized most of them. Ranchers, a banker named Coalfield from town, 2 men in suits she'd never seen before, and Braddock's foreman Vern Cutter standing by the window with his arms crossed and his eyes already fixed on her when she walked in, the way a man watches something he's been told he'll be dealing with later. Her uncle sat behind the desk that had once been her grandfather's. He'd acquired it the same way he acquired most things, by waiting until the previous owner was in no position to say no. Silas Braddock was 61 years old and had the kind of face that might have been handsome once, before whatever lived inside him had spent decades working its way to the surface. He was not a large man. He didn't need to be. He had learned early that fear was more efficient than size, and he had been practicing it for so long that it had become the most natural thing about him. "Mara," he said, like she was a pleasant surprise, though nothing in his eyes suggested she was. "Sit down." She sat because there was a chair directly in front of her, and because her legs were tired, and because sometimes the bravest thing you can do in a room full of hostile men is act like you're not scared of a single one of them. "You know why I called you here?" Braddock said. "No," Mara said. "I don't." That was true. She had guesses. Guesses kept her awake most nights. But she didn't know, not specifically, not yet. Braddock looked at her for a moment with something that might have been mild respect if you were feeling generous about it. Then he opened a folder on the desk and turned it to face her. It was a land assessment, Veyne Creek Ranch, her land. Her father's land before that, and his father's before that. The numbers were laid out in neat columns, and at the bottom, underlined twice, was an offer. It was insultingly low. Mara looked at the number. She looked at her uncle. She said, "No." The room shifted. Not loudly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But she felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, the whole room tightening by 1 degree. Braddock nodded slowly, like he'd expected this and had already decided it didn't matter. Mara, your father owed debts, you know this. I know what he owed, she said. I also know what the land is worth. These aren't the same number. The land is worth what someone will pay for it, Caulfield said from the side of the room, in the careful voice of a man who has practiced sounding neutral his entire career. And right now, Mara said, looking at the banker directly, which made him blink. The only person making an offer is sitting in that chair, and the offer is a third of fair value. So forgive me if I don't treat that as a market condition. Silence. And then, surprisingly, one of the men in the suits almost smiled. Almost. Braddock did not smile. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way men look at a problem they've already decided how to solve. They're just working out the sequence. You can't run that ranch, he said. It wasn't cruel the way he said it. That was almost worse. It was just a fact he was presenting, the way you tell someone their roof has a hole. Your herd is a quarter of what it was 2 years ago. You have no hired hands left. The windmill has been broken for 6 weeks. I know this because I've been watching, Mara, and what I've been watching is a young woman working herself to bone, trying to hold together something that is already falling. Every word was accurate. That was the thing about Silas Braddock that nobody ever quite prepared you for. He wasn't wrong about facts. He was just wrong about what facts meant. He looked at a struggling woman and saw an acquisition. He looked at a dying ranch and saw a transaction. He had spent so many decades measuring things by what they could be bought and sold for that he had genuinely lost the ability to see anything else. I appreciate your concern, Mara said, and her voice was steady because she had decided it would be. But the answer is no. Braddock looked at her for a long time. Then he looked over her shoulder at something behind her, and that's when Mara realized there was someone else in the room she hadn't accounted for. She turned. In the back corner, sitting in a chair slightly separate from all the others, was a man she had never seen before in her life. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little more, the kind of age that's hard to place on a man who has spent it outdoors. His clothes were clean but worn in the particular way that suggests they are always worn, not put on for occasions. He had a stillness about him that she noticed before she noticed anything else. Not the stillness of someone bored or disengaged, but the stillness of someone who was watching everything and choosing not to react to any of it yet. His hat was in his hands. His eyes met hers for exactly 1 second before dropping back to the floor. He looked uncomfortable, not with being in the room, with what the room was doing. This is Rhett Calder, Braddock said, and something in his voice had shifted, lighter now, almost jovial, which was somehow more alarming than his previous tone. He's been working cattle drives out of Colorado. Good man, looking for a stake. Mara looked at her uncle. She did not yet understand what was happening. Braddock spread his hands. The way I see it, we have a simple situation. You need help running that ranch. Your father's debt doesn't disappear because you're stubborn. The bank needs to be satisfied. He glanced at Caulfield, who nodded on cue. Mara, I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to keep it in the family. He's not family, she said. He could be, Braddock said. And there it was. Mara heard a sound from somewhere near the window. Cutter, she realized, suppressing something. And then Braddock said it plainly, because Silas Braddock had never in his life seen much value in dancing around a thing. You marry the man, he works the ranch, the debt gets restructured, and everybody gets what they need. Simple. Mara did not move. She did not speak. She was doing the thing she had learned to do in the months since her father died. She was giving herself exactly 3 seconds to feel the full weight of whatever had just happened before she allowed herself to respond. Because the responses she came up with in the first second were almost always the wrong ones. 1. Her uncle had invited a room full of men to watch him propose to marry her off to a stranger. 2. The stranger in question was sitting in the back corner looking at the floor like he was waiting for a dentist and already regretted making the appointment. 3. Braddock had framed this as help. He had framed this as family. He was watching her face with the careful attention of a man who believes he already knows the outcome and is just waiting for the moment when the other person figures it out too. No, Mara said. Braddock sighed. Mara, I said no. Then the bank calls the note, Caulfield said, from his spot by the wall, and the pleasantness was entirely gone from his voice now. End of the month. That's 64 days. He paused. Perhaps less, depending on administrative timelines. Mara looked at Caulfield. She looked at her uncle. She looked at the 14 men in the room who were all watching her with varying expressions of pity, impatience, and in Cutter's case, something she didn't want to look at directly. Then she looked at Rhett Calder. He was still looking at the floor, but something had changed in his posture. A slight tension through the shoulders, like a man who has just heard something that bothers him and is deciding whether it's his business. As if he felt her looking, he raised his eyes. There were a lot of things Mara would learn about Rhett Calder over the months that followed. His history, his losses, the specific kind of quiet rage that had been driving him for 5 years. But in this moment, the only thing she could read in his face was that he was embarrassed. Not for himself. For her. For what was being done to her in this room. It was such an unexpected thing to see on the face of a stranger that it almost knocked her sideways. Almost. I need a week, she said to her uncle. Mara, a week. She stood. I'm not signing anything today. I'm not agreeing to anything today. You want to sell me a solution? Give me a week to look at it from all sides. She picked up her gloves from her lap. Recall the note now and see what a judge thinks about a banker and a land buyer sitting in the same room when the terms get discussed. Caulfield's face changed. Braddock's did not. He just watched her go. She was at the door when she heard him say, almost gently, almost like an afterthought, "The barren one goes to the cowboy." And the men laughed. Mara did not stop walking. She did not turn around. She put one hand on the doorframe for exactly 1 second, not because she needed the support, but because she needed a full second to make sure her face was set the way she wanted it when she passed Dolan in the hallway, who was definitely listening. She walked out of Blackthorn Range with her spine straight and her jaw set and her eyes dry. She did not cry until she was a mile down the road, and even then it was quick, 2 minutes, 3 at most. Because she had learned in the past 4 months that grief and fury both ran out faster if you let them move through you instead of trying to hold them in, and she needed to be thinking clearly by the time she got home. Barren. The word had followed her for 2 years, since Dr. Aldridge in town had sat her down with the careful manner of a man delivering information he finds uncomfortable, and told her in his measured medical way that the infection she'd survived at 19 had left damage that would likely, he said, as if the qualification helped, prevent her from carrying children. She had not told many people. Her father had known. Her father had held her hand and told her that she was more than her capacity to produce heirs. And then he had died 8 months later, and she had been alone with the information and the land and the debt and the cattle that kept dying and the well that kept dropping and the hired hands who kept leaving for better situations because she couldn't pay them what they deserved. Her uncle had found out through means she'd never been able to trace. He'd been holding it for the right moment. Apparently this had been the right moment. She unsaddled her horse when she got home, checked the fence gap, found the 3 wandered cows 2 fields over, brought them back, fixed the gap with wire and stubbornness, then sat on the porch steps with a glass of water and tried to think. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up, expecting Dolan or Cutter or some other face she didn't want to see. Instead, it was Rhett Calder, riding a gray horse that looked like it had covered some distance, moving up the track toward her house with his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He stopped 20 yards away, looked at her, looked at the ranch. "Mind if I water my horse?" he said. "Trough's around the side," she said. He dismounted and led the horse around without another word. She heard him talking quietly to the animal while it drank. Not full sentences, just sounds, the way some people do with horses. And then he came back around the corner and stood at the bottom of her porch steps. "I didn't know what the meeting was for," he said. Mara looked at him. "Are you apologizing for my uncle's behavior?" "No, I'm telling you I didn't know." He paused. "There's a difference." There was. She gave him that. "How'd he find you?" she asked. "Word got around I was looking for steady work. He sent a man to Durango." Rhett turned his hat over in his hands once. "He told me there was a struggling ranch that needed a foreman. Said the owner was agreeable to new arrangements." "Agreeable," Mara repeated. "His word, not mine." She looked at him. The stranger who had driven from Durango based on her uncle's characterization of her as a problem awaiting a solution, and tried to decide what she thought about him. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed being used as a tool. He also didn't look like a man who had known he was being used as a tool until about an hour ago. "So now you know," she said. "What are you going to do about it?" It was a direct question, maybe more direct than the situation called for. But Mara had learned in the past 4 months that she didn't have time for the kind of slow circling that most social situations seemed to require. She needed to know who people were quickly, because the ones who would cause her problems didn't always look like they would cause her problems. Rhett looked out at the ranch again, at the barn that needed work, at the pasture that needed water, at the fence line she'd just repaired, which was obvious from 30 yards away because her wire stringing was functional, but not pretty. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I'd like an honest answer. All right? Do you want to save this ranch?" Mara blinked. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, it hadn't been that. "Of course I do." "Then let me help you." He looked at her directly, and she noticed his eyes were the particular gray of sky before rain. "Not the way your uncle means. Not any arrangement like that, just work. A week's worth. You feed me and let me sleep in your barn, and I'll show you what I can do." He paused. "After a week, you decide if I'm useful. If I'm not, I ride out, and you've lost nothing. You'd work for food and a barn floor." "I've worked for less." She studied him. He didn't look away. "Why?" she asked. It was, she would think later, the right question. It was the question that mattered. Any man could offer help. The question was always why. Rhett turned his hat over again, and for a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer, that he was going to say something vague and practical that didn't require him to tell the truth. Instead, he said, "Because what happened in that room today reminded me of something I've been trying not to think about for 5 years. He didn't explain what that something was. Not yet. But something in the way he said it, the specific weight of it, the way it sounded like a fact he was admitting rather than a story he was telling, made Mara believe him. Or believe enough. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that any man with a guilty conscience would have shifted his weight or found something else to look at. Rhett Calder looked at her and waited. "You start tomorrow," she said. "Dawn." He nodded, started to turn toward the barn. "Mr. Calder," she said. He stopped. "I'm not looking for a husband," she said, "or a foreman, or an arrangement of any kind." She held his gaze. "I'm looking for 64 days. He almost smiled. It changed his face entirely for just a second, and then it was gone. "Then that's what we're working with," he said. He went to see to his horse. Mara sat on the porch steps until the sun started dropping and the first breath of cooler air moved across the valley, and she thought about her uncle's voice when he'd said the barren one goes to the cowboy, and the sound of 14 men laughing, and the look on Rhett Calder's face in that back corner. Not laughing, not amused, not even neutral, just quietly, privately, embarrassed. For her. Which was, she thought, a strange and small and possibly important thing to notice about a stranger. She went inside and started cooking enough for 2. He was already working when she came out the next morning. That was the first thing she noticed. Not that he was awake, because she'd half expected that, but that he'd been awake long enough to have identified the 3 most critical problems on the property and started on the first one before she'd had time to boil water for coffee. The windmill was the one he'd chosen, which was the right choice, and she stood on the porch for a moment watching him climb the tower with a wrench in his back pocket and a length of rope over his shoulder, moving carefully but without hesitation. The way a man moves through a task he has done enough times that his body remembers it even when his mind is somewhere else. She brought him coffee anyway, left it at the base of the tower without saying anything, and went to feed the animals. By the time she came back, he was down and the windmill was turning. She stood there and listened to it. Just that sound, the slow creak and turn, the mechanical rhythm of water being pulled from the ground, and something in her chest did a complicated thing that she didn't have a name for. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when you've been bracing for impact for so long that not getting hit feels almost wrong. Bearing was stripped, Rhett said, coming up beside her. He had grease on his hands and had already drunk half the coffee. Surprised it lasted as long as it did. "I knew about the bearing," she said. "Why didn't you fix it?" "Because the part costs $4, and I've been deciding for 6 weeks whether I can afford $4. She said it flatly, the way you state a fact, and she watched him absorb it without flinching, which she appreciated. He just nodded. What else? She told him. She took him around the ranch the way she'd been carrying the list in her head for months. The east fence, the barn roof where 3 boards had rotted through, the corral gate that swung wrong and scared the horses, the creek diversion that her father had built 15 years ago and that had been slowly silting up for the past 2 seasons until it was now moving about half the water it should. She didn't soften any of it. She didn't apologize for any of it. She just walked him through the reality of where things stood. And Rhett walked beside her and listened and asked questions that were almost entirely practical and occasionally so specific that she had to stop and look at him. You've done this before, she said. Not a question. Run a ranch? Assessed one. He was quiet for a moment. They were standing at the creek diversion, looking at the silted channel, and she watched something move across his face. Not pain exactly, but the shadow of something that had once been pain and had since calcified into something harder to name. I grew up on one, he said. Colorado, outside of Alamosa. Grew up, or my family's, he said. Was my family's. The way he said was closed the subject with the finality of a door that is not slammed but simply pulled shut and held. Mara didn't push. She had doors like that herself. They worked until the light went bad that first day, and she fed him biscuits and salt pork and black-eyed peas that had been sitting in the pot since the day before. And he ate everything she put in front of him without comment, which she took as a compliment from a man who looked like he'd been eating trail food for weeks. They didn't talk much over supper. She had expected that to feel strange, sitting across a table from a man she'd met 24 hours ago in her dead father's house, a man her uncle had produced like a solution to a problem. She hadn't agreed was a problem, but it didn't feel particularly strange. It felt quiet, which was something she'd had plenty of and had learned to work with. After he went to the barn, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the numbers and looked at them for a long time. The windmill was fixed. That would help the water situation immediately, which meant the pasture in the north field would recover faster, which meant she could move the cattle there within the week and give the south pasture a rest it badly needed. It was a $4 fix that would cascade into several $100s worth of difference over the summer if it held. She closed the ledger and went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 months. She didn't examine that fact too carefully. The second day, Rhett started on the barn roof and fixed the corral gate before noon. The third day, he rode out to the east fence with wire and posts loaded on her father's old mule and was gone most of the day. And when he came back, the fence line was solid for 3/4 of a mile in each direction from where it had failed. The fourth day, he started on the creek diversion, which was a bigger project, and he worked on it through the fifth day too, knee-deep in cold water, moving silt and resetting stones and improvising with materials they had on hand, because the materials you'd want for the job were never quite the same as the materials you had. Mara worked alongside him that day. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't suggest she shouldn't, and they worked in the cold water together until the afternoon sun dried their clothes while they were still wearing them. And by evening, the creek was moving the way it was supposed to move, which was noticeably faster and cleaner than it had been moving since the previous fall. My father built this, she said, looking at it. Good design, Rhett said. He was wringing water out of his sleeve in the perfunctory way of a man who has been wet before and will be wet again and has accepted this as a feature of existence. He built everything on this ranch, she said. He wasn't a builder by training. He just figured things out. She paused. He was better at figuring things out than at most other things. Like what? She looked at him. He was asking the way you ask when you actually want to know, not the way you ask to fill silence. Money, she said. He was bad with money, not reckless. He wasn't a gambler or anything like that. He trusted people. He lent things when people needed lending. He deferred payments when people were struggling. He was generous with things he probably shouldn't have been generous with. She picked up a stone and put it back where it belonged in the diversion wall. By the time he got sick, the debts had been stacking up for years. He thought the land would cover it. He didn't think he was going to go so fast. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Did he know about Braddock? What your uncle was actually like? Mara considered this. He knew Silas was hard. He didn't know... She stopped. Maybe he knew and decided not to see it. My father had a way of choosing what to look at. That's different from being stupid, Rhett said. I know, she said, and she meant it. They were walking back toward the house by then, the last of the sun cutting long orange shadows across the pasture, and Mara was thinking about her father and about the particular loneliness of inheriting a problem someone else created without meaning to, when Rhett said, without preamble, "Braddock's done this before." She stopped. He kept walking 2 more steps before he stopped too, and turned. "What do you mean?" she said. The way he looked at her then, carefully, measuring something, told her that whatever he was about to say, he'd been deciding whether to say it for days. 5 years ago, he said, there was a ranch outside of Alamosa. Good land. Water rights that controlled access to a whole valley. The family that owned it, they got pressured to sell. Offer came in low. They said no. He paused. Then it was a series of things. Fence lines cut. Cattle disappeared. A hired hand got beaten badly enough that he left and didn't come back. The local law looked the other way. Mara was very still. And then, Rhett said, the barn burned. The silence between them stretched out long enough that she could hear the creek running behind them. Moving properly now, moving the way her father had built it to move. Braddock, she said. He was operating under a different name then. Different enough that it took me a long time to trace. He looked at the ground, then back at her. The family lost everything. They had to walk away from land that had been theirs for 30 years. What happened to them? Most of them. He said it like he was reporting facts from a document he'd memorized. My mother went to live with her sister in New Mexico. My younger brother took work on a cattle drive east. My father, he stopped. The particular kind of stop that tells you the sentence doesn't have a good ending. My father stayed, tried to fight it legally. The lawyers took what was left and the judge was in Braddock's pocket anyway. Mara understood now what he'd meant in that room when he'd said what happened today reminded me of something I've been trying not to think about for 5 years. She'd been looking for a motive she could trust. Here it was, and it wasn't comfortable, because it was built out of loss and a particular kind of anger that had been running too long and probably had corners she couldn't see yet. You've been following him, she said. I've been watching him, Rhett said. There's a difference. Following suggests I knew what I was going to do when I caught up. He picked up a stone from the path and turned it over in his hand and set it back down. I didn't. I still don't, entirely. But you know his pattern. I know every part of his pattern. His voice was flat and certain. The low offer, the debt leverage, the local officials who suddenly become cooperative, the gradual escalation. First it's pressure, then it's your hired help having accidents, then it's fires. He looked at her. You're at the pressure stage, Mara, but you won't stay there long. She had known this, in the way you know things you don't let yourself say out loud because saying them makes them more real. She had been sensing it in the tightening of Braddock's behavior, in Cutter's visits, in the way Coalfield the banker had said 64 days with a precision that suggested the number had been agreed on in advance. He wants the water, she said. He wants everything, but yes, the creek is the critical piece. Your land controls the water access for the whole east end of the valley. Without it, he can't expand the way he's planning. Rhett looked out at the creek, the one they'd just spent 2 days fixing. Which means when the pressure stops working, he's not going to wait very long before he tries something else. Mara thought about this. She thought about the east fence line Rhett had repaired, and about how it would look to Braddock's men if they rode past and saw it standing straight and solid where it had been lying broken before. She thought about the windmill turning. She thought about the water flowing clean through the diversion channel. He's going to know you're here, she said. He probably already does. And? Rhett looked at her steadily. And that's all right. I'm not hiding. That night she couldn't sleep, which was not unusual, but the reason was different. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and thought not about the numbers, but about what Rhett had told her. About Alamosa. About the pattern. About the sequence of events that started with low offers and ended with burned barns and broken families. And she thought about the fact that Rhett Calder had tracked Silas Braddock across territories for 5 years and had ended up here, at her table, by what appeared to be chance but probably wasn't, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He wasn't wrong about the danger. She'd known it was coming. What she hadn't had was someone who understood the specific shape of it. She closed the ledger, went to the kitchen doorway, and looked out at the barn where the lamp was still burning behind the slats. He was still awake. She could see the light moving, not a restless light, just steady, the lamp on a surface somewhere, and occasionally a shift in the shadow that meant he was moving around in there. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep for another hour. On the sixth day, Vern Cutter rode up to the ranch with two men behind him and the kind of easy, deliberate posture of a man who knows he's not going to get pushed back. Mara saw them coming from the garden. She'd been pulling weeds from between the bean rows, which was meditative work and exactly the kind of thing she needed on a morning when her nerves were already wound tight, and she straightened up and watched them come without moving. Rhett came around the side of the barn. He'd been working on something inside, like she could hear he had been, and now he stood at the corner of the barn with his hands loose at his sides, not reaching for anything, just present, and the three riders slowed when they saw him in a way that told her they hadn't expected him to be there. Cutter looked at Rhett. Then he looked at Mara. Then he looked at Rhett again. "Miss Veyne," Cutter said, pulling up. He had a voice that was always slightly too pleasant, like a man who learned early that sounding friendly cost him nothing and was sometimes useful. "Vern," she said, "Mr. Braddock wanted me to check on things, see how you're managing." "I'm managing fine," she said. Cutter looked around the property with the particular kind of looking that isn't admiration but inventory. His eyes moved from the windmill to the barn to the fence line visible at the edge of the property, and she watched him doing math he wasn't expecting to have to do. "Things look different," he said. "Work'll do that." His eyes came back to Rhett. "Who's this?" "Ranch hand," Mara said. "Didn't know you had the money for a ranch hand." "I have the money I have," she said. "Is there something specific Mr. Braddock wanted to know, or is this a social visit?" Cutter's pleasant expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. He was recalibrating. He'd come out here expecting a certain version of Veyne Creek, struggling, deteriorating, a woman barely holding on. And what he was looking at didn't match that version, and that was information he was going to take back to Braddock, and Braddock was not going to like it. "He wanted to remind you," Cutter said, "about the timeline. End of the month. The offer still stands, but Mr. Braddock's patience isn't unlimited." "Tell Mr. Braddock I appreciate his patience," Mara said, "and that I'll be in touch when I'm ready." Cutter looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then his eyes moved to Rhett one more time, slowly, assessingly, and Rhett looked back at him with an expression that could only be described as politely empty. No hostility, no challenge, just a steady absence of anything that gave Cutter anything to grab onto. "Friendly advice," Cutter said, mostly to the air between them. "Situations like this have a way of getting complicated." "Situations like what?" Mara said. Cutter smiled. "Good day, Miss Veyne." They rode out. Mara and Rhett stood watching them go, and neither spoke for a moment. "He'll report back tonight," Rhett said. "I know. Braddock will move faster now. Seeing the ranch in better shape, that changes his timeline." "I know that too." She brushed dirt from her hands. "Are you going to tell me we should have hidden the improvements? Pretended things were still falling apart?" "No," he said. "I'm going to tell you that the next move is his, and it's coming sooner than 64 days. She went back to the bean rows. He went back into the barn. And the windmill kept turning above them both, slow and steady, pulling water from the ground the way it was supposed to. 3 days later, they rode into Cinder Hollow together for supplies. Mara had been making this trip alone for months, and she knew every stop on it. The general store where Hattie Marsh weighed things with her thumb on the scale if she thought you weren't watching, the feed merchant who would try to sell her last season's grain at this season's prices, the post office where Delbert Finch would look at her with the particular kind of sympathy that is actually a form of superiority. She knew these people the way you know the people of a small town when you've grown up adjacent to it. Not well, not warmly, but with the practiced accuracy of long observation. She noticed the change as soon as they rode in. People were watching. Not the way they usually watched when she came in. The glancing looks, the slight turning away, the careful non-involvement that Cinder Hollow had perfected under Braddock's long influence. This watching was different, more direct. There were people who stopped on the boardwalk and looked at her and Rhett together with the specific attention of a town absorbing new information. "They're scared of him," Rhett said quietly, as they tied up outside the general store. "They're scared of Braddock," Mara corrected. "They always have been. Some of them saw what happened to the Pollard family 3 years ago, the McAllister place the year before that. And nobody said anything." Who would they say it to? Sheriff Gaines has been in Braddock's pocket since before I was born. She stepped up onto the boardwalk. This is just how things are here. Inside the store, old Ellis Marsh looked up from behind the counter and did the complicated facial expression of a man who has decided he is not going to take sides and is finding this harder than he expected. He greeted Mara with his usual neutrality and then looked at Rhett with the carefully calibrated wariness of someone assessing how much trouble the stranger was likely to cause. "This is Rhett Calder," Mara said. "He's working at Veyne Creek." Ellis nodded in the specific way that means I'm registering this information and I'll be discussing it with my wife tonight. Mara started in on her list: flour, salt, coffee. She was almost out of coffee, which had been making the early mornings more difficult than they needed to be. Lamp oil, a spool of wire. She was reading through the rest of it in her head when the door opened behind them and 3 men came in. She knew them. Braddock's men. Not Cutter this time, lower down the chain, the kind of men Braddock used for the early stages of pressure because they were big enough to be threatening without being senior enough to tie him directly to anything. Their leader was a man named Burl, wide through the shoulders, who had the particular gift of making everything he said sound like a threat without ever saying anything that technically was one. He stopped when he saw Rhett. Something passed through his eyes, recognition, or maybe something his boss had told him. "Miss Veyne," he said, ignoring Rhett. "Funny running into you." "Is it?" she said. "Mr. Braddock was saying just yesterday he hoped you were thinking seriously about the offer." Burl moved to the other side of the store, pulling a can from the shelf in a way that made it clear he had no interest in buying it. "Be a shame if you ran out of time and didn't have anywhere to go." Ellis behind the counter was looking very carefully at a point on the wall slightly to the left of everyone. "The lady's shopping," Rhett said. Burl looked at him. "I wasn't talking to you." "I know," Rhett said. "I'm talking to you." Burl set the can down. He was a man who had spent years being the largest thing in any room he entered, and the adjustment required when that stopped being true was one he'd never learned to make gracefully. He looked at Rhett with the specific expression of a man running calculations he isn't certain about. "You're the hand she hired," he said. "That's right." "Passing through?" "Through?" "Staying," Rhett said. The word landed in the store the way a stone lands in still water. A single clear impact, and then the ripples moving outward. Ellis's hands went still on the counter. Burl's 2 men, flanking him, exchanged a glance. And Burl himself was doing something complicated with his expression, trying to decide if this was a situation that called for escalation or retreat. He chose something in between, which was the coward's choice but also the smart one in the moment, because Rhett was standing in a way that made escalation look like it might not go the direction Burl preferred. "Enjoy your shopping," Burl said to Mara, and walked out with his men close behind. The store was quiet. Ellis let out a breath that he'd clearly been holding for some time. "You're going to make things difficult," he said, though it wasn't clear if he was addressing Mara or Rhett or both of them together. "Things are already difficult," Mara said, and finished her list. On the way back out, she passed the blacksmith shop, where a man named Pete Garfield was doing something to a wagon wheel that required most of his attention and a great deal of his vocabulary, and he looked up when she went by and nodded at her, with an expression that was somehow both apologetic and helpless, and she nodded back without stopping. At the edge of town, a woman named Clara Hogg came out of the millinery and said, "Miss Veyne." And when Mara turned, Clara looked at her for a moment with something that was hard to read: pity and guilt, and possibly the earliest stages of something that hadn't turned into courage yet, but was thinking about it. "You holding up all right out there?" Clara said. "Holding up," Mara said. Clara glanced at Rhett, then back at Mara. She lowered her voice even though no one was near enough to hear. "You be careful," she said. "People are saying Braddock doesn't like being made to wait." "I know," Mara said. "I mean it, girl." Clara's eyes were serious in the way of a woman who knows something she wishes she didn't. "After the Pollard place, what happened there? That wasn't an accident. Everyone knows it wasn't an accident. Nobody said so, but everyone knows." Mara looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara's jaw worked for a moment. "Because I should have said something to the Pollards," she said, "and I didn't." She went back inside. Mara and Rhett rode home in silence for the first several miles, and then Rhett said, without looking at her, "People are starting to pay attention." "Doesn't help much if they're just watching," she said. "Not yet," he said, "but the watching is how it starts." She didn't answer. She was thinking about Clara Hogg's face, the particular quality of guilt in it, the weight of something she'd been carrying for a while that was finally looking for somewhere to set itself down. And she was thinking about Burl walking out of the store when he probably would have preferred not to, and about what Cutter's face had looked like when he'd ridden into Veyne Creek and found a windmill turning and a fence line standing and a man there who looked at him like he wasn't owed anything. She was thinking about how fear works, how it grows in the absence of anything to push against it, and how even small things can begin to diminish it if they're real. She was also thinking about what Rhett had said about Braddock's pattern, and about the fact that they were now past the low offer stage and well into the pressure stage, and that what came next, the acceleration, the escalation, was a matter of when, not if. They were 3 miles from home. When Rhett said, "I need to tell you something else," she waited. The evidence, the records, the deeds, the ledgers Braddock keeps that document every land acquisition he's made. I have reason to believe he keeps them at Blackthorn Range. Physical copies, locked up. He paused. Because a man like him can't trust banks or lawyers with that kind of information. He needs to hold it himself. Evidence of what? Everything. Fraud, forgery, money paid to officials who ruled in his favor when they shouldn't have, records of transfers made under coercion. He was looking straight ahead, at the road. Enough, if it got to a federal marshal, to end him. She let that sit for a moment. "You've been thinking about this." "For 5 years," he said. "You're not just talking about defending the ranch," she said. "No," he said. "I never was." She looked at the side of his face, the profile of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time, and was now, carefully, piece by piece, setting it down where she could see it. And she understood that what he was offering her was not just help. It was the same thing she was offering him, a reason that was bigger than just one person's survival. She should have been frightened by that. Part of her was. The other part recognized it as the first honest thing that had happened to her in months. "What would we need to do?" she said. He glanced at her, and the thing that crossed his face was not a smile exactly, but something quieter and more complicated. Relief, maybe, or the particular feeling of a weight shifting from one set of shoulders to 2. "First," he said, "we survive what's coming." They came home to the smell of smoke. Not much. A trace of it, an edge on the wind. And for a disorienting second, Mara thought the stove had been left on, and then she registered the direction it was coming from, and her stomach dropped. The east pasture. She put her heels to her horse and rode hard, and Rhett was right behind her, and when they came over the low rise and saw it, a line of charred grass along the fence Rhett had repaired 2 weeks ago, scorched earth in a long diagonal scar. She felt something cold and clarifying settle into her chest. It hadn't reached the cattle. The wind had been wrong for it, or they'd caught it early enough, or both. The damage was real but not catastrophic. 60 yards of fence gone, the grass on one side of it burned back to dirt, a water trough scorched and cracked. Not catastrophic, but a message. Rhett stood at the edge of the burn line and looked at it for a long time without speaking. His jaw was tight. She could see him working through something internally. Not panic, not even anger exactly, but a slow process of moving from one state to another, the way a man shifts from one kind of readiness to another when he finally sees confirmation of a thing he already knew was true. "They came through the back property," he said. "The fence was repaired, so they went around the far end and did it from outside." "Cutter?" "Cutter or Burl, or someone else entirely. Doesn't matter who lit it." He looked at her. "What matters is that this is the next step. They're done warning." Mara stood in the smell of burned grass and looked at the cracked water trough and thought about her father, who had built this fence 30 years ago, and about the fact that she had just watched Rhett spend 2 days repairing it, and about Clara Hogg saying I should have said something. "What do we do?" she said. Rhett looked at the burn line. Then he looked at the ridge where someone had stood close enough to touch the fence. "We stop being reactive," he said. "We stop waiting for the next thing they do and we go get what we need to end this." He turned to face her fully. "Mara, the evidence. If it's there, and I believe it is, we need to get to it before he escalates further, because the next fire won't be in the pasture." She knew what he was saying. He was saying that after 64 days or 30 or 15, Whenever Braddock decided the timeline had run out, the next fire would be the barn, or the house, or both. She looked at the burn line. She looked at Rhett. "When?" she said. "Soon," he said, but not without help. She didn't ask what kind. She could already see the outline of it forming, the shape of what had to happen, the pieces that had to move, and the fact that some of those pieces were people who had been standing on boardwalks in Cinder Hollow, looking away for a long time, and who were maybe, just maybe, getting tired of the weight of it. Clara Hogg's face, Pete Garfield's nod, the woman in the millinery who had lowered her voice and said, "Everyone knows." A town's courage doesn't appear all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It starts the way a creek starts. A trickle here, a trickle there, the ground slowly saturating until one morning there's enough current to actually move something. Veyne Creek was flowing properly again. And something else, something harder to see and slower to build, was starting to move beneath the surface of Cinder Hollow, fed by years of accumulated guilt and the particular human exhaustion of living in fear. Rhett started repairing the fence that evening. He worked by the dying light until he couldn't see the wire, and Mara held the lamp and handed him tools, and neither of them spoke much, and the burned smell was still in the air around them, sharp and persistent and impossible to ignore. But the windmill was still turning, and the creek was still running, and somewhere in Blackthorn Range, in a safe that Silas Braddock believed was untouchable, there was a record of every crime he had ever committed. Names and dates and payments and forged signatures, years of careful wrongdoing, documented in the handwriting of a man who had never once believed he would be held accountable for any of it. That belief, Mara thought, holding the lamp steady while Rhett worked, was going to be the most expensive mistake he ever made. The man who came to Veyne Creek on a Tuesday morning 3 days after the pasture fire was not someone Mara had ever seen before, and that alone put her on edge, because by now she had cataloged every face connected to Braddock's operation within 20 miles, and this one didn't fit any of them. He was older, mid-50s maybe, with the kind of weathered face that suggests a life lived mostly outdoors and not always comfortably. He rode a decent horse, but not a showy one, and he came up the track slowly, with his hands visible, which was either good manners or the practiced behavior of someone who understood how people on a threatened ranch might react to unexpected visitors. Rhett saw him from the barn roof where he'd been replacing the boards that had rotted through. He came down the ladder without rushing and stood at the corner of the barn, and Mara came out of the house, and they both watched the man ride in. He stopped at a respectful distance. "Miss Veyne." "Who's asking?" she said. "Name's Garrick Vale." He looked at her, then at Rhett, then back. "I used to work for Silas Braddock." The morning was very quiet for a moment. A crow called from somewhere over the east pasture. The windmill turned. "Used to," Rhett said. 3 years ago, Vale said. "I left. Or he encouraged me to leave, which amounts to the same thing." He reached into his coat slowly, watching them watch him, and produced a folded piece of paper. "I heard what's been happening out here, the fire, the visits from Cutter." He held the paper out without moving his horse forward. "I think it's time somebody said something." Mara looked at Rhett, who was watching Vale with the careful attention of a man who has learned not to trust the things that appear at convenient moments. But she could see him working through it, reading the older man the way you read weather, looking for what's real underneath what's visible. "Get down," Mara said finally. "I'll put coffee on." Vale told his story at her kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug, and the particular manner of a man who has been deciding whether to speak for a long time and has finally decided that the cost of staying quiet has gotten higher than the cost of talking. He had been Braddock's operations manager, not his enforcer, not his legal man, but the person who coordinated the practical side of acquisitions, the logistics. He'd spent 2 years telling himself that what he was doing was just business, that the pressure Braddock applied was not so different from what any aggressive land buyer did, that the people who lost their properties were unlucky, but not specifically victimized. Then came the Pollard Ranch. "I won't go through all of it," Vale said, "but I was there when Cutter gave the order for the barn. I didn't light anything. I didn't stop anything either." He looked at his hands. Tom Pollard was 62 years old. He had a bad heart. He died 8 months after they took the place. His wife said it was the stress. Vale set down the mug. "I know it was the stress." The kitchen was quiet enough that Mara could hear the coffee still settling in the pot. "Why now?" Rhett said. He wasn't hostile, just direct, the way he always was when he needed an answer he could actually use. Because Cinder Hollow has been living under this man's thumb for 15 years, and nobody has done one thing about it, Veyne said. And because I've been watching you two, he glanced between them, hold this place together when everything said you shouldn't be able to, and because I know something that might matter. He reached back into his coat, and this time produced not a single paper but a small bundle of them, folded together and held with a piece of string. I kept copies, he said, not of everything, but of enough. He set the bundle on the table. Land transfer records, 3 of them, Pollard, McAllister, and the Hatch family up by Ridgecrest, all showing the signatures of men who told me privately they signed under duress. He paused. And 1 letter, from Braddock to Sheriff Gaines, discussing a payment. Mara picked up the bundle. She untied the string carefully, the way you handle something that might be more fragile than it looks, and opened the first document. She read for a minute. Rhett leaned over and read with her. The transfer documents were dry, bureaucratic, the language of legal forms that had been designed to look routine. But once you knew what you were looking at, once you knew that the Pollard signature on page 3 was written by a man with a bad heart, who had been told his alternative was worse, the routine language turned into something else entirely. The letter to Gaines was 4 sentences long and not subtle. This is enough to take to a federal marshal, Rhett said. He said it quietly, the way you say a thing when you're still measuring it against what you hoped for. It's enough to start, Veyne said. The originals, the complete records, are at Blackthorn Range. I know where he keeps them. There's a safe in the study behind the left panel of the bookcase. He looked at Rhett. I'm telling you this because I think you already knew something like them existed, and I think you've been thinking about how to get to them. Rhett's expression didn't change, but his stillness shifted quality. The particular stillness of a man who has just been read accurately by someone he's not sure he trusts yet. You'd testify, Mara said to Veyne, to what you saw at the Pollard place. Yes, Veyne said. I will. I should have done it years ago and I didn't, and I have to live with that. But I'll do it now. After Veyne left, with an agreement to meet again in 4 days to bring whatever else he could gather, and with Mara's word that she would not tell anyone he'd been there, Rhett stood on the porch for a long time looking at the road the older man had ridden out on. Do you believe him? Mara said. I believe he's guilty, Rhett said. That's not the same as believing everything he said, but it's a start. He turned. He's right about the safe. I didn't know the specific location, but I knew Braddock would keep physical copies somewhere he controlled directly. A man like him doesn't trust documents to anyone else. You were already thinking about getting to them. I've been thinking about it since before I got here, he said. It was the first time he'd said it that plainly, and she appreciated the plainness even though it complicated things. That's why you came to Cinder Hollow in the first place, she said. Not because Braddock sent for you. Or, not only because. He looked at her. He sent for me because he heard I was looking for ranch work. That part was true. But when I found out where he was, what he was doing, I put myself in the path of that message. He paused. I wanted to get close enough to find out if what I suspected about the records was right. And instead you ended up at a meeting where he tried to marry you off to a problem he was having. Yes, Rhett said, and then, after a beat, though the problem turned out to be more capable than he told me. It was the driest thing he'd said to her in 3 weeks, and she almost smiled. Almost. This changes the plan, she said. It accelerates it, he said. Veyne gave us a location and a corroborating witness. But if we're going to use either of those things, we need to move before Braddock finds out Veyne talked. He looked at the horizon, the direction of Blackthorn Range. And we need someone we can take this to, someone with authority outside of Gaines's reach. Federal Marshal, Mara said. There's one in Denver, Gideon Shaw. He's been building a case against land fraud in this territory for 2 years. I know this because I wrote to his office 8 months ago and got a response that said they were investigating but needed more. He looked at her. More is what we now have. Denver is 3 days' ride. 2.5 if you push. She understood what he was saying before he finished saying it, and she didn't particularly like it, but she understood it. Getting to the records at Blackthorn Range was one thing, and it was not a small thing. It was dangerous and uncertain, and required the kind of careful planning that neither of them had unlimited time for. But even with the records, Someone had to carry them to an authority that couldn't be bought, and that someone would be traveling alone across open country while Braddock's men were watching the roads. "We haven't gotten the records yet," she said. "No," he said. "But we need to know you can make the ride when we do." She looked at him. "You're not going to suggest I stay out of the Blackthorn part?" "I was going to," he said honestly. "Then I thought about it." "And?" "And I decided that suggesting it would be a waste of time that we don't have." She nodded. "All right, so we plan." They planned. It took 4 days, and the planning was not clean or elegant. It was the messy, practical, argument-filled process of two people who had different knowledge about different pieces of a problem, trying to build something that used all of it. Rhett knew Braddock's operation, his rhythms, the layout of Blackthorn Range from the outside and partially from the inside. Mara knew the land, every trail, every dry creek bed, every stand of trees between Veyne Creek and Braddock's property, with the granular accuracy of someone who had grown up riding it. They argued twice. Once about timing. Rhett wanted to move within the week. Mara thought they needed another week to be sure about the guard rotation at Blackthorn. The second argument was about Vale, specifically about whether to bring him into the operational planning or keep him at arm's length until they needed his testimony. Rhett didn't trust Vale's presence at the ranch. Mara thought he was being overcautious and said so. Rhett said there was no such thing as overcautious when Braddock was involved, and Mara said there was if it slowed them down past the point where caution still mattered. They compromised. Vale would be contacted by message only, through a third party they both agreed on, until after they had the records. The third party was Pete Garfield, the blacksmith. This was Mara's idea, and she brought it to Rhett on the evening of the third day, with the directness of someone who has thought something through and decided it's right, even if it's uncomfortable. "He felt something when I walked past his shop," she said. "I saw it. He's been carrying the Pollard thing the same way Clara Hogg has. These people aren't cruel. They're scared, and scared people will move if you give them a reason that feels solid." Rhett was quiet. "You want to bring civilians into this?" "I want to bring neighbors into this," she said. "There's a difference. Braddock's power in this valley depends on everyone believing they're alone and being afraid of him. The minute even 2 or 3 people start acting like they're not alone." She stopped. "You said it yourself. The watching is how it starts." He looked at her for a long moment. "Pete Garfield. He's strong enough to be useful, and he's angry enough. And his shop is on the main road. He sees everything that moves through Cinder Hollow. If Braddock shifts anything, Pete'll know about it." The next morning, Mara rode into town alone. She tied up outside the blacksmith shop and went in and found Pete Garfield doing what he was usually doing, which was hitting something metal with another piece of metal in the focused, rhythmic way of a man who is good at his work and knows it. He looked up when she came in and nodded and kept working for a moment before he set the hammer down. "Miss Veyne," he said. "Pete." She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of his shop in the smell of iron and coal smoke and looked at him directly. "I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." He crossed his arms. "All right." "The Pollard barn," she said. "You knew it wasn't an accident." His jaw tightened. "Clara Hogg told me," she said. "Not in those words, but enough. And I can see it in your face right now, so don't bother working out how to deny it." Pete Garfield looked at her for a long moment. He was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they'd been sculpted from the same material as the things he worked on. He had lived in Cinder Hollow his whole life. He had watched Braddock build his empire piece by piece and had done exactly what everyone else had done, which was keep his head down and his family safe, and tell himself that silence was different from complicity. "What do you want from me?" he said. "Right now, just information," she said. "I need to know if anything changes at Blackthorn Range in the next week. Extra riders. Men coming or going at odd hours. If you see anything moving that way." She held his gaze. "Later, I might need more than that. I'm telling you now so you can decide." Pete was quiet for a long time. The forge crackled. Outside, a wagon went past on the road. "That man you've got working the ranch," he said. "Calder." "Yes." "He's been following Braddock." It wasn't a question. Pete was smarter than people gave him credit for, which was something Mara was beginning to notice was a pattern in Cinder Hollow. The people who had survived under Braddock's influence had done so partly by being underestimated. "For 5 years," she said, "Braddock destroyed his family's ranch in Colorado. Something moved across Pete Garfield's face. Not surprise, but more like a piece falling into place, confirming a shape he'd already half seen. "I'll watch the road," he said. "That's all I'm asking for now." She was at the door when he said, "My wife's cousin was with the McAllister family when they lost the place." He didn't look at her when he said it. He was looking at the forge. She's never been right since. Something went wrong with her after. Something that doesn't have a name. Mara stood in the doorway and let that sit where it fell. "I know," she said, and left. The message from Pete came on a Friday, delivered by his youngest son on a horse that had been ridden harder than a 13-year-old boy usually rode, and it said 3 words: "Men moved out." Rhett read it and looked at Mara. "He's sending riders somewhere," he said, "which means Blackthorn is lighter than usual tonight." "Tonight," she said. Not a question. "Tonight," he said. They left after dark, taking the long way around, the dry creek bed route that Mara knew from childhood, the one that added 40 minutes to the ride but kept them below the ridgeline and out of sight of the main road. She led, and Rhett followed, trusting her knowledge of the terrain the way he'd trusted her on other things. Not blindly, but with the specific quality of confidence that comes from watching someone be right enough times that the trust has been earned rather than assumed. The night was clear and the moon was 2/3 full, which was both help and hazard. Enough light to see, enough light to be seen. They left the horses in a stand of cottonwoods a 1/4 mile from Blackthorn's outer fence and went the rest of the way on foot. The ranch was quiet. Lights in 2 windows of the main house, one in what Mara guessed was the bunkhouse. 2 men visible, one near the barn, one doing a slow circuit of the main yard. Fewer than she'd ever seen at Blackthorn, and she'd ridden past it enough times to know what normal looked like. Pete's message had been right. Braddock had sent men somewhere. The question was where. That question would have to wait. They moved along the fence line to the point Mara had identified as the best entry, a section where a stand of old juniper came close to the fence and created a shadow long enough to work in. Rhett went over first, then Mara, and neither of them made a sound that the night would carry. The study window was on the east side of the house. Ground floor. Rhett had confirmed this from memory. He'd been inside Blackthorn Range the morning of the original meeting, waiting in that back corner of the study while Braddock's plan unfolded around him, and he'd spent that time the way he spent most time in unfamiliar spaces, which was memorizing it. The man near the barn had his back to them. They moved. The window was latched but old, and old latches have a particular give to them that patience can work with. Rhett worked it with a folded piece of leather he'd brought for exactly this purpose, and after 2 minutes that felt like 20, the latch turned and the window swung inward with a small sound that the night absorbed. Inside the study, the smell was of old paper and tobacco, and it was dark enough that Mara had to give her eyes a full minute to adjust before she could make out the shapes of furniture. Rhett was already moving toward the bookcase on the left wall, feeling along the panel face with his fingertips, systematic and unhurried in a way that she could only manage by following his lead and controlling her breathing. The panel was there. The seam was barely visible even in direct light, and in this darkness it was effectively invisible. But Rhett found the catch, a small metal peg set flush with the wood, and pressed it, and the panel swung open on a pivot. The safe behind it was a combination lock, which was the moment Mara's careful calm started to develop a crack in it. "You can open it?" she whispered. "Vale gave me the combination," he said. "It was in the message." She had not known this. "When were you going to tell me that?" "I'm telling you now." He worked the dial. His hands were steady in a way she wasn't entirely sure hers would be, and she was watching the door and the window alternately and trying to keep track of where the man outside the barn had been in his circuit, and the seconds were stretching in that particular way time stretches when the stakes make every moment feel like it should be taking less time than it is. The safe opened. What was inside was not dramatic to look at, just papers, bundled and organized with the methodical care of a man who thinks of his crimes as transactions, and transactions as things that require proper record-keeping. Mara reached past Rhett and started pulling bundles out, checking each one by the thin moonlight from the window, and within a minute she had confirmed that what Vale had described was here: land transfers, correspondence, a leather-bound ledger with entries going back 8 years that documented payments to officials in 4 different counties and 3 different territories. "Take all of it," Rhett said. "It won't fit in—" The saddlebag I left with the horses is bigger than it looks, he said. Take all of it. She took all of it. She moved quickly and as quietly as she could, and she had everything transferred to the canvas bag she'd brought when they heard it. A voice, outside, closer than it should have been. The second guard, the one doing the circuit of the yard, was on the east side now, and his circuit had brought him closer to the study window than either of them had planned for. Rhett put his hand on her arm. They both went still. The voice outside said something to someone Mara couldn't see, and another voice answered, and for approximately 30 seconds, the two men were directly outside the east wall of the study, close enough that she could hear the specific words. Something about a horse with a loose shoe. Something about supper being held. And she was not breathing, and she was pretty certain Rhett wasn't either. Then the voices moved away. They waited another full minute. Then Rhett nodded, and Mara went out the window first with the bag, and he followed, pulling the window back to its original position before dropping to the ground. And they moved to the fence line without running. Running makes noise. Running looks like exactly what it is. And over the fence and into the shadow of the junipers. Mara's hands were shaking by the time they reached the horses. Not badly, but enough to tell her that the calm she'd maintained in the study had been a performance she'd been giving for herself as much as for the situation. And now that the situation had loosened its grip a little, her body was responding with its honest opinion. Rhett looked at her in the moonlight. You all right? Fine, she said, which was partially true. Your hands are fine, she said, and took the reins with both of them to prove it, and mounted, and he mounted, and they rode back the way they'd come. Slow, quiet, through the creek bed, under the ridge, with the full record of Silas Braddock's 15 years of theft and coercion in a canvas bag across Mara's saddle. They didn't speak much on the ride back. There wasn't much to say that the situation hadn't already said. When they got to Veyne Creek and unsaddled the horses in the dark barn, Rhett put the bag on the workbench and Mara lit the lamp, and they stood together looking at it for a moment, just looking at it, the unremarkable canvas bag that contained unremarkable papers that added up to something that could end a man who had not been ended for 15 years. You need to leave tomorrow, Rhett said. I know. I'll map the fastest route. Shaw's office is on Federal Street in Denver. I have the address written down from his letter. He paused. You push hard, you can be there in under 3 days. And while I'm pushing hard, she said, you're here. Someone needs to be here, he said. When Braddock finds out the safe was opened, and he'll find out quickly, probably by morning, he's going to come here first. This is where he'll expect both of us to be. She understood the logic. She didn't like the part of the logic that had him alone at Veyne Creek when Braddock arrived, with the realization that his entire empire's paper foundation had just walked out of his study. You can't hold this place alone, she said. I can hold it long enough, he said. That's all I need to do. She looked at him across the workbench, across the bag, across the lamp between them that made his face sharp and shadowed, in the way of a man who is deciding things he hasn't finished deciding. Rhett, she said, if he comes here with the men Pete said he sent out, then I'll deal with that. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have tonight. He looked at her steadily. Mara, you getting those documents to Shaw is the only thing that actually ends this. Everything else is just buying time for that to happen. You understand? She understood. She hated it the way you hate a truth that doesn't leave you any good alternatives. Pete, she said, and Clara, and whoever else in Cinder Hollow has been carrying this long enough to want to set it down. What about them? They're going to know something happened when I'm gone and you're here alone, she said. And some of them, Pete, maybe Clara's husband, they're going to make a choice about what to do with that. She held his gaze. Let them. He was quiet for a moment. You think they'll come, he said. I think fear has a breaking point, she said, and I think this valley has been living past that point for a while. I think all they've needed is something to show them that the ground is solid enough to stand on. She picked up the canvas bag. That's what we just gave them. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she was aware of the lamp between them, the late hour, the specific intimacy of two people who have just done something frightening together and are standing in its aftermath. I'll have the horses ready at first light, he said. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a while with the canvas bag in front of her, and the ledger open to the first page of entries. Neat, controlled handwriting, dates going back to when she was 8 years old. And she read it with the steady, deliberate attention of someone who wants to understand completely what she's carrying and why it matters. She read the Pollard entry. She read the McAllister entry. She found, on a page dated 4 years before her father died, an entry that made her stop. Her father's name was not in it, but the entry was about water rights in the Eastern Valley, and the dollar amount attached to an official's name was the exact amount Caulfield, the banker, had once told her was the origin of a debt her father had taken on and never been able to explain to her satisfaction. She sat with that for a long time. Her father, who trusted people, who lent things when people needed lending, who had thought he was taking on a manageable debt and hadn't known that the debt had been engineered, that the circumstances which made it necessary had been manufactured by a man with a ledger and a pen and 15 years of practice in making theft look like bad luck. She closed the ledger. Outside, the windmill was turning in the night wind, steady and unhurried, pulling water from the ground the way it was supposed to, the way it had always been supposed to before a stripped bearing and a $4 part had stopped it. Her father had built this ranch. Braddock had spent years quietly dismantling the conditions that allowed it to survive. And tomorrow morning she was going to ride to Denver with the proof of it in a canvas bag. And whatever happened at Veyne Creek while she was gone, whatever Rhett faced alone, or with whatever help Cinder Hollow finally decided to offer, the outcome of this story was going to be written by something other than fear. She made sure the lamp was trimmed properly. She checked the door. She went to bed and lay in the dark for a while and thought about her father and about the way courage works. Not all at once, not cleanly, not without cost, but forward, always forward, one decision past the last one, until enough decisions have accumulated that the direction is unmistakable. She slept. She did not dream. At first light, she was already dressed and the canvas bag was over her shoulder when she came out to find Rhett standing at the corral gate with her best horse saddled and a second set of saddlebags that were heavier than yesterday's. "Food for 4 days," he said, "in case it takes longer than you plan." She took the reins. She stood there for a moment with the morning light coming flat and pale over the eastern ridge, and she looked at him. At the man who had walked into a room 2 months ago to rescue a woman he didn't know and had ended up with his own chance at the justice he'd been chasing for 5 years. And she tried to find the right words for what this moment was. She didn't find them. "Don't get killed," she said. Something in his face shifted. "Same," she wrote out. She didn't look back because she already knew what was behind her. The ranch, the windmill, the repaired fence, gate watching her go. And looking back at things you're afraid of losing had never once in her life made them safer. She rode forward. Behind her, Rhett Calder went back to the barn and started moving things around inside it with the efficient, purposeful manner of a man who is preparing a position and does not intend to surrender it. And in Cinder Hollow, Pete Garfield opened his shop at the usual hour, and before the morning was an hour old, Clara Hogg appeared in his doorway with her husband behind her, and after them came 2 farmers from the East Road whose names Mara would only learn later. And they stood in the smell of iron and coal smoke and talked in low voices about what they'd seen and what they knew and what, finally, they intended to do about it. The ground was holding. Braddock found out about the safe by mid-morning. Rhett had expected this. He'd been awake since before Mara rode out, moving through the ranch in the gray pre-dawn light, with the specific focus of a man who is converting a defensive position from theory into reality. He'd moved the horses to the back corral, away from the barn. He'd identified the 4 approaches to the main house and assessed each one for cover and angle. He'd gone through the tool shed and found 3 things that could be repurposed, and one thing, a length of heavy chain, that could not but that he kept anyway, out of the stubbornness that comes from not wanting to leave any option unexamined. He was on the barn roof, ostensibly finishing the last section of replacement boards, when he saw Cutter coming. Not 2 men this time, not 3. 7. They came fast, no pretense of a social visit in their pace, and Rhett came down from the roof and stood in the yard and watched them come the way he'd been watching things come for 5 years, with the steady, pre-calculated calm of a man who has already decided that whatever happens next, he is not going to be the one who flinches first. Cutter pulled up hard in the yard, and his horse threw its head, and Cutter didn't appear to notice because he was already looking at the house, then the barn, then Rhett, doing the rapid inventory of a man whose morning has already gone badly and is arriving somewhere expecting it to get worse. "Where is she?" "Where is she?" Cutter said. "Not here." Rhett said. Cutter looked at him with an expression that had moved past the careful pleasantness of his previous visits into something rawer underneath. I was angry, genuinely, personally angry, the kind of anger that happens when a man who is used to controlling situations discovers that a situation has been moving without his knowledge. "You broke into Mr. Braddock's home," Cutter said. "Interesting accusation," Rhett said, "from a man whose employer set fire to a pasture 2 weeks ago." "Where did she go?" Not a question this time, a different register entirely. "I don't know," Rhett said, which was technically true. He knew the destination, not the exact route, and he wasn't going to split that hair out loud. Cutter looked at him for a long moment, and Rhett could see him working through the calculation. Whether this was the moment, whether the 7 men behind him were sufficient, whether Braddock's instructions had authorized this specific escalation, or whether he was still meant to be operating in the range of pressure rather than violence. "Mr. Braddock would like to speak with you," Cutter said. "Both of you. At Blackthorn." "I'll pass," Rhett said. Another long moment. The 7 men behind Cutter were still on their horses, and Rhett was on the ground in the open yard, and the math of the situation was not favorable to him by any reasonable calculation. And both he and Cutter understood this, and both of them also understood something else, that the kind of man who stands in an open yard and says, "I'll pass to 7 mounted men," is either very stupid or very certain about something that isn't visible yet. And Vern Cutter had been in enough situations to know that Rhett Calder was not stupid. "You have until tonight," Cutter said. "Until tonight to do what?" "To make this easier on yourself." He gathered his reins. "After tonight, Mr. Braddock stops asking." They rode out. Rhett watched them go, and when the sound of hooves on the dry road had faded enough, he let out a long breath through his nose and went to the water trough and put both hands in the cold water and held them there for a moment. Not because his hands were dirty, because he needed to do something with his body that wasn't standing perfectly still, projecting certainty he wasn't entirely sure he possessed. He had until nightfall. Mara was maybe 12 hours into a 2.5-day ride. He went back to work. He was reinforcing the barn door hinges, a task with no defensive application whatsoever, just something that needed doing and that gave his hands something real to focus on. When he heard a horse on the track and looked up to find Pete Garfield riding in on a bay workhorse that was clearly not accustomed to being ridden anywhere with urgency and was expressing its opinion about this through its entire body. Pete pulled up and got down with the particular deliberateness of a large man dismounting a resentful animal, and he looked at the yard and then at Rhett. "Cutter was here," Pete said. It was not a question. "Hour ago," Rhett said. "I saw them ride out from town." Pete looked around the property, the same assessment Cutter had done, but with a completely different quality. Not inventory, but evaluation, the way a man looks at a place he's trying to figure out how to help with. "How bad?" "He said tonight," Rhett said, which means probably before tonight. Men like Cutter say tonight because it sounds like they're giving you a choice. They come before tonight because coming early takes away the time you'd use to prepare. Pete absorbed this with the slow gravity of a man who is outside his expertise and knows it. "What do you need?" Rhett looked at him. He'd been told about Pete's involvement. Mara had explained it the night before she left, laying out what she'd set in motion with Pete and Clara and the others, and he'd listened with the reserved assessment of a man who has learned that people volunteering to help in dangerous situations sometimes mean it and sometimes don't know what they're volunteering for. Pete Garfield, standing in the yard of Veyne Creek on a horse that was already trying to walk back toward town, looked like a man who meant it and also maybe didn't fully know what he was volunteering for. "I need you to be honest with me," Rhett said. "What do you actually know how to do in a situation like this?" Pete was quiet for a moment. "I can shoot," he said. "Not fancy, but I can shoot." "That's something," Rhett said. "What else?" "I can move heavy things," Pete said. And then, with the first trace of dry humor Rhett had seen in him, "I'm told I'm difficult to move myself." Rhett almost smiled. "Are you alone?" "Clara's husband is coming. Henry Walsh from the East Road said he'd ride out this afternoon." Pete paused. "There might be 2 more. I don't want to promise you numbers I'm not certain of." "Don't," Rhett said. "Whatever shows up is what we have to work with." He put Pete to work immediately, because idle time in a situation with a deadline was the enemy of clear thinking, and because Pete was right that he was useful for moving heavy things. By midday, they had repositioned the empty water wagon to create a barrier across the main approach to the barn, and they'd moved a significant quantity of stored lumber into a position that was useless as lumber but functional as low cover, and they'd worked out between them a basic plan for the 4 approaches that accounted for the people they had and the people they probably didn't. Claire's husband arrived shortly after noon. His name was Frank, and he was a wiry, quiet man in his 50s who carried a rifle that had seen considerable use and moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd had military experience at some point and hadn't entirely lost it. He shook Rhett's hand, looked around the property once, said, "What do you need me on?" And that was about the total of his introduction. Henry Walsh arrived an hour later, bringing his older son, who was perhaps 19 and had the wide-eyed seriousness of someone who has talked himself into something and is now in the presence of its reality. Rhett put the son with Pete, reasoning that Pete's general solidity would be steadying. 2 more men came in the mid-afternoon, brothers named Diggs, farmers from up the North Road whose property had been pressured by Braddock 2 years ago, and who had sold, reluctantly, for less than the land was worth, and who had apparently been looking for a reason to feel differently about that ever since. 6 men total, counting Rhett, against what would likely be considerably more than 6. Rhett looked at what he had and made the kind of peace with it that you make with things you can't change. Not acceptance, not confidence, just the deliberate decision to work with reality as it exists rather than as you'd prefer it. He gathered them in the barn and talked for about 15 minutes. He didn't make it sound better than it was. He told them what Cutter had said, what Braddock's pattern looked like at this stage, and what he assessed the evening would bring. He told them that the goal was not to win a battle. It was to hold long enough, to make the cost of taking Veyne Creek high enough that Braddock's hired men made the calculation most hired men eventually made, which was that no paycheck was worth dying for. Most of these men are professional, he said. Mercenaries, essentially. They're dangerous, but they're rational. They'll push hard at first. If we hold the first push, they'll regroup and assess. That's the window. The window for what? One of the Diggs brothers said. For it to become expensive enough that someone thinks twice, Rhett said. Frank, who had been listening with his arms crossed, said, "You're buying time." "Yes," Rhett said. "For her to get to Denver," Frank said. "Yes." Frank nodded once. "All right." It was that simple, and it was that complicated, and every man in the barn understood both of those things, and none of them left. Rhett went to the house and ate something. He couldn't have said afterward what it was, because he ate it with the automatic efficiency of someone fueling a machine rather than tasting a meal. And he sat at Mara's kitchen table for a few minutes in the quiet of the house, which was a different kind of quiet from the barn or the yard, the quiet of a space that had been lived in long enough to hold the character of the person who lived in it. He looked at the ledger she'd left on the table, the entry she'd found about her father's debt. She'd told him about it before she rode out, standing in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light, and he'd watched her face while she talked, the way she held it steady, the way the steadiness was real, but it was also maintained like a structure that has been reinforced because it needed reinforcing. She had not cried. He hadn't expected her to, but he'd watched for it anyway, because sometimes the things people are most controlled about are the things that are most likely to undo them later, and he didn't want her undone on a 3-day ride alone. But Mara Veyne, he had learned, carried her grief the way she carried everything, forward, integrated, part of the momentum rather than a weight against it. She was sad about her father in a way that ran through everything she did rather than stopping her. It was, he thought, a harder way to do it than the way he'd done it, which was to put his losses in a box and use the box as fuel and try not to look at what was inside the box too often. He washed his dish and went back outside. They came at dusk, not quite when Cutter had said 2 hours before sunset, when the light was still enough to see by but dropping fast, which was its own kind of calculation. The choice of a man who wanted visibility, but also the psychological advantage of arriving with the dark coming in behind him. Rhett counted 19 men on the first pass. 19. He was in the barn loft with a clear sight line to the main approach, and he counted them twice, once when they came over the rise, and once when they spread out along the fence line, the way men do when they're preparing to press forward simultaneously from multiple points. 19 versus 6. He heard Pete below him, at the barn door, say something very quietly that was probably not intended to be heard, and he understood the sentiment. Cutter came forward alone, the way he had the first time, and stopped at the edge of the yard and called out in a carrying voice that had the flat, practiced quality of a man delivering a predetermined speech. "Calder, this is your last chance to walk away from this. Mr. Braddock has no issue with you personally. You can ride out right now and nobody's going to follow you." Rhett looked at the 19 men spread along the fence line. "What about the people who live here?" he called back. "Mr. Braddock's dispute is with the Veyne estate, not with hired help." "I'm not hired help," Rhett said, "and the answer is no." A pause. "Your choice," Cutter said, and rode back to the line. The first push came from 3 directions at once, which told Rhett that Cutter was competent at this kind of thing, whatever else he was. The men on the left flank moved for the fence line near the house. The men on the right moved for the barn. The center group moved straight up the main approach with the confidence of numbers. What they discovered was that the main approach now had the water wagon across it, which slowed the center group, and that the right flank approach to the barn had 3 men behind the repositioned lumber who opened up with a coordinated noise that was more alarming than damage-causing at that range, but that accomplished the specific goal of making the right flank group stop and recalculate. The left flank made it to the fence near the house before Frank, positioned in the kitchen doorway with his military rifle, demonstrated that he had not lost whatever he'd learned at some earlier point in his life. The left flank stopped. It was not a victory. Rhett was not confused about this. What it was a pause. The moment of reassessment he'd described in the barn, the moment when hired men counted their options, the way you count money and decided whether the job still paid. The reassessment lasted about 4 minutes. Then the second push began, and this one was harder and better coordinated, and it came from the north side where Rhett had the least coverage, and by the time Pete got to the north fence, the 2 Diggs brothers were already engaged with 3 men who had come over the fence and were now inside the property. Rhett came down from the barn loft. He crossed the yard in the failing light and put himself between the advancing center group and the house, because the house was where the documents would be if anyone knew to look for them there, and because Mara had left it standing and he was not going to be the person who let it stop standing. What followed was not cinematic. It was close, disorienting, and loud, and Rhett took a hit in the left side that he registered as pain and cataloged as not immediately incapacitating and filed away to deal with later. He gave back considerably more than he received, partly because he was good at this, and partly because anger, carefully maintained and correctly aimed, is a surprisingly effective resource. But they were losing ground. The north fence was compromised. Henry Walsh's son had taken a blow to the head from a man who'd come over the fence behind him and was sitting against the barn wall with his hand pressed to his face and blood between his fingers, conscious but not functional. One of the Diggs brothers had pulled back to the barn with a torn-up shoulder. Frank was still in the kitchen doorway, but 3 men had gotten around the house to the east side, and Frank couldn't cover both. Rhett stood in the yard and looked at the situation and did the math. And the math was clear. He went to the barn, to the corner where he'd put his rifle that morning, and he came back out and fired twice into the air. Not at anyone, just up, the signal he and Pete had agreed on that morning. The one that meant hold what you have, don't press forward, wait. Because holding what they had was all they needed to do. He just needed the night to be long enough. It very nearly wasn't. The third push came an hour after dark with torches, and this was the one that scared him. Not for himself, but for the barn, for the house, for the specific horror of watching something burn that someone had spent their life building. 2 torches made it over the north fence, and the grass caught near the fence post, and Pete came out of nowhere, big, fast, moving with the purpose of a man who has stopped calculating and started acting, and put out the first one with his coat, which he then had to drop because his coat was on fire, and Rhett got the second one with the water bucket that had been sitting by the barn door all day for exactly this reason. The grass burned for 20 feet before they stopped it. The fence post was scorched, but standing. In the aftermath of the third push, there was a stillness, the kind that follows something that almost happened when everyone involved is taking stock of how close the almost was. Rhett's side was bleeding through his shirt. Pete was standing in the yard without his coat, which would have been funny at any other moment. Frank had come around the house and was looking at the scorched fence line with an expression of such controlled fury that it was, in its own way, more alarming than the push that had caused it. "They're pulling back," Pete said. Rhett looked. He was right. The men along the fence line were drawing back, regrouping, a visible hesitation in their movement. "Why?" Pete said. "Because we're still here," Frank said. "And it's costing them more than they planned." Rhett said nothing. He was watching the fence line and calculating, and what he was calculating was that the next push would come soon, and it would be the one they couldn't hold, because holding 3 pushes with 6 men against 19 had used up most of the margin they had, and the margin that remained was thin enough that he could see through it. He needed more time. He didn't have more time. And then he heard hoofbeats, not from the fence line, from the road, from the direction of Cinder Hollow. Multiple horses, moving fast, the drumming sound of them coming up the track in the dark. And Rhett's first cold thought was that Braddock had sent for reinforcements, because of course he had. Of course there were more. And then he looked at Pete, and Pete was looking at him, and they were both listening to the sound get closer. The horses came over the rise and into the firelight from the still smoldering fence grass. Rhett counted 12 riders, and then he recognized the man at the front, which was Ellis Marsh from the general store, who was not a man anyone in Cinder Hollow would have predicted to be the first person over a rise on a horse in the middle of a fight, and behind Ellis was a woman he slowly identified as Clara Hogg, who had apparently decided that watching from doorways was done. And behind Clara was a group of men and 2 more women whose names Rhett would spend the next several days learning, people from Cinder Hollow who had been talking in Pete's blacksmith shop since morning and had then gone home and gotten their horses and their rifles and ridden out in the dark. Not because anyone told them to, because the ground was solid enough, finally, and they were done with the wait. Cutter saw them from the fence line. Rhett watched Cutter do the count. The 6 people at Veyne Creek, the 12 who had just arrived, the ratio that had just shifted from impossible to merely difficult, and he watched Cutter's face do the thing that faces do when a calculation reverses. Cutter sat on his horse for a long moment. Then he turned it and rode away from the fence. The men with him followed, not quickly. The specific measured pace of people who have decided something but don't want it to look like a decision. And Rhett watched them go with his hand pressed to his side and the smell of scorched grass in his nose, and Pete standing next to him saying under his breath something that was approximately, "Well." Ellis Marsh dismounted in the yard and looked at the scorched fence and the patched barn and the man with the blood showing through his shirt and said, with the compressed understatement of a man who has been running a general store for 30 years, "We came as quick as we could." "You came," Rhett said, which was what mattered. He sat down. He didn't mean to. It was not the planned next step. But his legs decided it was time, and he sat on the ground in the yard with his hand on his side and looked up at the cluster of Cinder Hollow citizens who had ridden out in the dark for a woman who wasn't here and a man they didn't know. And he thought about the moment in his father's kitchen in Colorado, 15 years or 5 years or 1,000 years ago, when everything had been burning and there had been no one coming, no one on the road, no hoofbeats, just the dark and the fire and the sound of something irreplaceable being lost. He sat in the yard of Veyne Creek with blood on his shirt and 12 new faces looking down at him, and he breathed through the specific feeling of that memory, meeting this moment, and he let it be what it was. Clara Hogg pushed through the group and crouched in front of him and looked at his side with the direct efficiency of a woman who is not going to let squeamishness be the thing that stops her from being useful. "That needs cleaning," she said. "I know," he said. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then get up," she said. Not unkindly, just directly, the way people talk when the situation calls for it. "We'll get you inside." He got up. Inside the house, Clara worked on his side at Mara's kitchen table while Pete stood in the doorway, and Ellis Marsh moved around the room with the slightly lost quality of a man who has arrived somewhere after something significant happened and is trying to figure out where he fits in the aftermath. Frank had gone back to the east side of the house to keep watch, because Rhett had said, through clenched teeth while Clara did what needed doing, that Cutter pulling back was not the same as Braddock letting go, and Frank had nodded with the comprehension of a man who understood exactly what that distinction meant. "She'll make it to Denver," Pete said from the doorway. "She'll make it," Rhett said. He said it without qualification because anything else would have been indulgence. "What happens when she does?" Ellis said, from his spot by the window. "Shaw comes," Rhett said, "with authority that Gaines can't touch." "And Braddock?" "Gets arrested," Rhett said, "or runs. Either way, it ends." Ellis was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had weighed things with his thumb on the scale for 30 years, in the small, accumulating way of someone who has convinced himself that small advantages are not the same as dishonesty. And Rhett could see him doing a different kind of weighing now. The weight of what he'd let happen in his town against the weight of what he'd ridden out into the dark to do tonight. "I watched those men come into my store," Ellis said. 3 times, 4 times. I always found somewhere else to look. Nobody responded to that because there was nothing to say to it that Ellis Marsh didn't already know. "The Pollard family," Ellis said. "Tom Pollard used to buy his coffee from me every Wednesday." The kitchen was quiet. Clara tied off the bandage with a firmness that was either medical precision or personal feeling, probably both. "He used to complain that I charged too much for it," Ellis said. His voice had gone to a different place, somewhere quieter and less composed. "And he was right. I did." He stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because you're carrying it," Pete said from the doorway. "Same as the rest of us." Rhett looked at the 2 men, Ellis by the window, Pete in the doorway, separated by everything and connected by the specific thing that people who have lived in the long shadow of someone else's power are connected by, the shared knowledge of what silence costs and the belated, complicated, imperfect decision to stop paying it. "She's going to need hands," Rhett said. "When this is over. The ranch. It'll take time to rebuild properly. People who know cattle, people who can work fence." Pete nodded. "We know people." "She'll pay fair wages," Rhett said. "She's that kind." He knew this as certainly as he knew anything about Mara Veyne, which was more than he'd known about most people in the last 5 years, partly because she was the kind of person who was easy to know accurately, and partly because he'd been paying attention since the moment he sat in the back corner of a study and watched her look at an insultingly low offer and say no in the voice of someone who had already done the math and found that her self-respect was not for sale. He slept in the house that night because Clara refused to let him go back to the barn, and because he was tired enough that arguing about it was not a contest he could win. He woke twice. Once when Pete did a circuit of the yard and came back and reported nothing, and once when he heard something outside and lay still for 30 seconds, working out whether it was a threat or just the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek, and decided it was the wind. He lay awake after the second time and thought about the documents in the canvas bag, moving toward Denver in the dark, carried by a woman who had been handed to a stranger as a joke, and had turned that joke into the architecture of a different future. He thought about what she'd said on the porch that first week. "I'm not looking for a husband. I'm looking for 64 days. He hadn't said anything at the time. He'd gone to see to his horse. But he'd thought about it. He'd thought about it more than was probably appropriate for a man who'd been in the county for 4 days. And he'd filed the thought under things he was not going to examine until the current situation had resolved itself, because the current situation required clarity, and some thoughts have a way of making clarity difficult. 64 days had come and gone. They were on the other side of it now, in the territory that 64 days of working and watching and fighting had built together. And what was in that territory was something he didn't have a precise name for yet. It was something he recognized, though. He'd known it before, in the years before Colorado, before the fire, before he'd converted his grief into motion and spent 5 years in motion instead of staying still long enough to feel the full weight of what he'd lost. It felt like stakes. Not the kind that come from danger. He'd had those for 5 years and they were familiar and survivable. These were different. These were the stakes that come from wanting something to still be there when the danger was over. He wanted Veyne Creek to still be there. He wanted Mara Veyne to come back from Denver and find it standing. And he wanted, in the quiet particular way of a man who has not wanted things for himself in a long time, to still be here when she did. He closed his eyes. Outside, the windmill turned in the night wind, steady and unhurried. The creek ran in the dark, and somewhere on the road between Cinder Hollow and Denver, Mara Veyne was riding through the last of the night with a canvas bag across her saddle, getting closer with every hour to the man who could end this. And the only thing standing between her ranch and the morning she'd come home to was a night that was almost over, a handful of neighbors who'd finally decided they'd had enough, and Rhett Calder, who had come to Cinder Hollow following one man's crimes and had found something he hadn't been looking for and was not going to let burn. He slept. Dawn came slow over the eastern ridge, the way it does in late summer. Gradual, almost reluctant, the light building in degrees rather than arriving. Pete was awake when it got there, standing at the fence with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the road from Blackthorn Range the way you watch a thing you expect to move. It stayed still. Cutter did not come back that morning. Neither did Braddock's men. What came instead just before noon was a rider Rhett didn't recognize, young, hard-ridden, with a horse that needed water and a message that had been carried fast from the direction of the main road south. The rider found Rhett in the yard and handed him a folded piece of paper and said, "From the lady. She said to tell you she made it." Rhett opened the paper. It said, "Shaw has the documents. He's coming. Hold." 2 sentences. He read them twice, the way you read something when you need to be sure you're reading it correctly and not reading what you want it to say. Then he looked up at Pete, who was watching him from the fence with the particular attention of a man who has been waiting for news and has run out of patience for waiting. "She made it," Rhett said. Pete let out a breath that had probably been held in one form or another since the previous evening. Ellis Marsh, who was still there, who had not gone home, who had slept in his saddle against the barn wall and woken up stiff and had not complained about it, looked up from where he was sitting on an upturned bucket near the water trough and said, "How long?" Rhett looked at the road south, the direction the rider had come from. "Not long," he said. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket, against the bandage Clara had tied, and he stood in the morning light of Veyne Creek Ranch and breathed the air of a place that was still standing, and he thought that not long was the best answer he'd heard in 5 years. Federal Marshal Gideon Shaw arrived in Cinder Hollow on a Thursday, 2 days after Mara's message reached Veyne Creek, and he did not arrive quietly. He came with 6 deputies and a federal warrant and the particular authority of a man who has been building toward a specific moment for 2 years and has finally arrived at it, and the town felt the difference immediately, not because he announced himself loudly, because he didn't, but because there is a quality to legitimate power that is different from the kind Braddock had been exercising for 15 years. And people who have lived under the counterfeit version recognize the real thing when it shows up, even if they can't articulate exactly why. Mara rode in with them. She looked like a woman who had covered a lot of ground in a short time and had not slept much of it. There were shadows under her eyes, and her clothes had the particular set of someone who has been in the saddle too long. But she was upright, and her jaw was the way it always was, which was to say set. And when she rode past the general store and Ellis Marsh came out onto the boardwalk and saw her, something moved across his face that was complicated and genuine and not entirely comfortable. She nodded at him. He nodded back, and the nod had weight in it, the weight of a man acknowledging a debt he cannot fully repay but is not going to pretend doesn't exist. Shaw went directly to the sheriff's office, which was the procedurally correct thing to do, and which also happened to be exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds to walk into a law office that you are about to dismantle and inform its occupant of that fact. Sheriff Gaines was a man of 60 who had held his office for 22 years, which is a long time to hold any office, but a particularly long time to hold one whose primary function has been to protect the interests of a single wealthy man. He was not cruel in the way Cutter was cruel. He was smaller than that, the specific smallness of a man who has chosen accommodation over integrity so many times that he has forgotten what the alternative felt like. He sat behind his desk when Shaw walked in and looked at the federal warrant and the 6 deputies arranged behind Shaw, and the expression on his face was not anger or defiance. It was the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific morning for a long time and has just realized this is it. "Samuel Gaines," Shaw said, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of bribery, obstruction of federal investigation, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Gaines looked at the warrant. He looked at Shaw. He said very quietly, "All right." He didn't argue. He didn't reach for anything. He stood up from behind his desk with the slow, tired movement of a very old man. Which he wasn't, not really, but accommodation does that to people. It ages them in ways that have nothing to do with years. Shaw handed the warrant to one of his deputies and looked at Gaines with the flat, professional calm of a man who has done this before and will do it again and has learned not to take any of it personally. "Where's Braddock?" Gaines was quiet for a moment. "Blackthorn Range," he said. "He doesn't know you're here yet." "No," Shaw said. "He doesn't." Mara was outside when they brought Gaines out, sitting on her horse and watching the street, and she saw Clara Hogg standing on the boardwalk across the road with her hands clasped in front of her, and the expression of someone watching history arrange itself into a shape she'd been hoping for long enough that seeing it actually happen felt unreal. Mara looked at Clara, and Clara looked at Mara, and between them, across the width of that dusty street, passed something that didn't need words. The specific acknowledgement of two women who had both been carrying something heavy and were watching the weight begin to shift. Then Mara turned her horse toward Veyne Creek, because that was where she needed to be, and she let it move at a pace that was faster than it probably should have been given that the horse had also covered a lot of ground in a short time. But the horse seemed to understand urgency the way working animals sometimes do, and it carried her home in good time. She came over the rise and saw the ranch, and she stopped the horse for a moment on the crest of the hill. The windmill was turning. The fence lines were standing, the scorched section near the north post visible even from this distance, a dark scar in the grass, but the post was up and the wire was strung. The barn was there. The house was there. She counted the horses in the yard and recognized most of them, including Pete Garfield's bay, which was tied to the corral fence with the expression of an animal that has been asked to be somewhere unusual for an extended period and has accepted this without enthusiasm. Rhett came out of the barn when he heard her coming, and he walked into the yard and stopped. She rode up and dismounted, and they stood facing each other in the yard of a ranch that was still standing, and she took in the bandaging visible at his collar line and the specific, careful way he was holding his left side. And he looked at her face with the full attention of someone accounting for damage, and they were both doing the same thing, which was checking each other for what had been lost in the days they'd been apart. "Shaw's in town," she said. "I know. His rider came through an hour ago." He looked at her. "You all right?" "Fine," she said, which was more true than the last time she'd said it. "Your horse needs water." "I know." She didn't move immediately to lead the horse to the trough. She stood in the yard and looked at him, and looked at the ranch, and looked at the scorched fence post, and then back at him. "How bad was it?" "We held," he said. "That's not what I asked." "Bad enough," he said. "Nobody died. Pete's shoulder. He'll have a scar. He seems to consider it an acceptable outcome." Rhett looked at her steadily. "Walsh's son took a knock on the head that scared everyone considerably for about 20 minutes. He's fine now. Headache that won't quit, but fine." She nodded. She let out a breath she'd been carrying since she'd ridden out of this yard 4 days ago, and the breath had things in it: relief and guilt, and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running on necessity alone and has finally stopped running. "I should have been here," she said. "You were exactly where you needed to be," he said. "And so was I." She looked at him. He looked at her. Take care of your horse," he said. "Then come inside." Clara left food. He went back into the barn. She led the horse to the trough. The food Clara had left was a pot of stew that had been kept warm on the stove, and a half a loaf of bread, and a jar of preserves that Mara recognized as Clara's own, the ones she made in September from the plums that grew along the creek east of town. And she ate at her kitchen table in the kind of thorough, unself-conscious way that hunger that has been running on its own fumes eventually demands. Rhett sat across from her with coffee and watched her eat without commenting on it, which she appreciated. "Shaw is going to Blackthorn this afternoon," she said, between the bread and the stew. "He asked me to be there for the warrant, as a witness to the documents." "I'll ride with you," he said. "You don't have to." "I'll ride with you," he said again. And the second time there was no room in it for negotiation, not because he was being authoritative, but because he was being clear. And there was a difference, and she had learned to hear it. She finished eating and sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen and thought about the ledger page with her father's name adjacent to it. Not in it, exactly, but close enough that the implication had kept her company for 3 days on the road. She thought about what it meant that Braddock had been building his control of this valley since before she was grown, since before she understood that the world had people in it who used other people's trust as a resource to be depleted. Her father had been trusting. He had been generous. He had been, in the specific way of good people who move through the world as it should be, rather than as it is, occasionally taken advantage of. These were not failures. She had decided this on the road, in the dark, with the canvas bag heavy on her saddle. They were not failures. They were the cost of being the kind of person who lends things and defers payments and believes that the man across from him is operating in good faith. The failure had not been her father's. The failure had been Braddock's and Gaines's and Coalfield's, and the failure of a town that had allowed fear to become so normalized that it had started to feel like weather, something you lived with rather than something you could change. She pushed back from the table and rinsed her dish in the basin and went to get her horse. They rode to Blackthorn Range in the mid-afternoon. Mara and Rhett and Pete Garfield, who had refused to go home despite being told twice that there was no particular reason for him to come along. And Pete had said both times that he had a particular reason of his own, and nobody had pressed him further on it. Shaw and his deputies were already there when they arrived. Blackthorn Range was, or had been, 4 hours ago, an empire. Seeing it now, with federal deputies moving through the main yard and men being separated from their weapons, and the general organized disruption of a legal authority arriving with sufficient force to make its authority felt, it looked smaller than it had. Not physically. The buildings were the same size, the corrals the same extent. But there is a quality that fear gives to a place that power alone cannot, and the fear had begun draining out of Blackthorn Range the moment Shaw had ridden through its gate, and without it the scale of the thing was just buildings and land, considerable but not extraordinary. Braddock was in the main house. He had not run, which surprised Mara until she thought about it, and then didn't surprise her at all. Running requires an acknowledgement that you have lost, and Silas Braddock was a man who had been constructing his version of reality for so long that even arriving at his own front door was not the final word on the matter. He was in his study, the study with the bookcase and the empty safe, when Shaw came in, and he was sitting behind the desk that had once belonged to Mara's grandfather, and he was, improbably, calm. Mara stood in the doorway and watched Shaw present the warrant, and she watched her uncle read it. Braddock read it the way he had read the resistance of every person who had ever refused his offer, with the specific patience of a man who is accustomed to being the last word on any subject, and is still, even now, waiting for the situation to correct itself into the shape he prefers. Then he looked up and saw Mara. There was a moment, just a moment, when something real moved across Silas Braddock's face. Not guilt. She had not expected guilt, and she did not see it. What she saw was something older and stranger than guilt, something closer to genuine confusion, the specific confusion of a man who has spent so long inside the logic of his own worldview that the presence of consequences feels like a violation of natural law. He had looked at her, 2 months ago, as a problem to be managed. He had looked at a woman who was struggling and had seen an acquisition. He had arranged her life like furniture and laughed when his arrangement was accepted. And he had genuinely, in the specific smallness of his imagination, believed that the story ended there. He had not imagined that she would ride to Denver. He had not imagined that she would come back. Mara, he said, and even now the voice was the voice of a man explaining something to someone who is about to understand they were wrong. This is Mr. Braddock, Shaw said, and the flatness of the title, not Uncle, not Silas, but Mr. Braddock, the formal reduction of a man to his least personal designation, seemed to register somewhere, and Braddock stopped. Shaw read the charges: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, bribery of public officials, coercion, arson, in the case of the Pollard Ranch. A list that went on long enough that the room they were standing in seemed to get smaller with each item, and when it was done, the silence that followed had a particular quality. The silence of something that has been said aloud for the first time after a long time of being known and not said. Braddock was taken out of the study and through the main room and out the front door of Blackthorn Range, and Mara stood back and let him pass, and he looked at her as he did, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said better. Pete Garfield, standing in the yard outside, watched Braddock come through the front door with his hands bound in front of him, and Pete's face did something that took a moment to identify because it was not a simple thing. It was relief and anger and grief all pressed together, the specific face of a man who has been carrying something for years and is watching the reason for it be led away in handcuffs. Rhett was standing near the fence, slightly apart from the rest of it, and Mara went to him. He was watching Braddock being taken to the waiting transport with the expression of a man who has been moving toward a specific point for 5 years, and has now arrived at it, and is doing the complicated work of figuring out who he is on the other side of that arrival. She recognized it because she'd been doing her own version of it since she'd handed the documents to Shaw in Denver and walked out of his office into the street and stood in the afternoon light of a city that didn't know her name and thought, "It's done, and now what?" "How does it feel?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. He kept watching Braddock until the man was out of sight, and then he looked at the ground and then at her. "Smaller than I thought," he said. She nodded. She understood this exactly. "Not bad," he said, "just smaller, like carrying something heavy for a long time and then setting it down and realizing the heaviness was partly the carrying, not just the weight." "Does it feel finished?" she said. He thought about this with the genuine care of someone who has learned not to give answers they don't mean. "No," he said, "not finished, but over." He looked at her. "Those are different." "Yes," she said, "they are." The ride back to Veyne Creek that evening was quiet in a different way from the quiet she had accumulated over the past months. Not the quiet of vigilance or grief or exhausted calculation, but the quiet of two people who have done something large together and are letting it settle before they decide what to say about it. Pete rode ahead of them most of the way, which Mara suspected was deliberate. When they were close enough to see the windmill turning on the horizon, Rhett said, "I had a thought while you were gone." She waited. "About the north pasture," he said. "The silting in the creek diversion. We fixed the main channel, but there's a secondary feed that's been blocked longer. If we cleared it before the end of the season, the north pasture could carry a significantly larger herd by spring." She looked at him. "You were thinking about the north pasture." "Among other things," he said, while Braddock's men were pressing the fence line. "The fence was holding," he said. "There was time." She almost laughed. She didn't quite, but it was close. The genuine surprised edge of almost laughter, the kind that comes up unexpectedly and surprises you. "The secondary feed would take 2 days of work," she said, "maybe 3. 2 if we have help," he said. "Pete might be available once his shoulder heals properly." "Pete's shoulder is going to be his excuse for avoiding difficult work for at least 6 months," she said. "He's already laying the groundwork." This time Rhett smiled, the real version, the one that changed his whole face, and it was still as surprising as it had been the first time she'd seen it on her porch when she'd told him he started tomorrow at dawn. They rode into the yard of Veyne Creek as the last of the sun was pulling down behind the western ridge, and the windmill was still turning above them, and the creek was still running in the middle distance, and the scorched fence post was still visible against the sky, but so was the wire Rhett had strung taut and straight and holding. She unsaddled her horse. He unsaddled his. They worked in the barn in the comfortable quiet of two people who have done enough things alongside each other that silence has stopped being something that needs to be filled. When they were done and the horses were settled, she leaned against the stall door and looked at him across the barn, in the lamplight, and she said, "You could have ridden out, after Denver, when it was clear Shaw was coming." He stopped what he was doing. "You'd done what you came to do," she said. "Braddock's finished. The evidence is in federal hands. Vale is testifying. You could have left." He looked at her steadily. "I know. Why didn't you?" He set down the brush he'd been holding and turned to face her fully, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at things all along. Not performing honesty, but just being it, which was harder and less comfortable but had the specific quality of something you could rely on. "Because I didn't want to," he said. "Because somewhere in the past 2 months I stopped. The thing I was doing. I stopped running towards something and started being somewhere." He paused. "I haven't been somewhere in 5 years." She looked at him. "And the somewhere is here," she said. "The somewhere is here," he said. Not tentative, not asking, just saying a true thing the way he said all true things, which was plainly. "You'd need wages," she said. "Actual wages, not barn floor and beans." "I've been sleeping in the house for a week," he said, "because Clara bullied you into it." "Clara is very persuasive." "She is," Mara said. "She's also going to be insufferable about this." "About what?" "About—" Mara stopped. She looked at him. She thought about the morning she'd fed 2 people for the first time since her father died, and about the windmill turning after 5 weeks of stillness, and about the specific way she'd started sleeping again. Not well, not without difficulty, but more than before, and differently. "About the fact that she was right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Was she?" he said. "She told me," Mara said, "the second time she came out to check your bandage, that a man who fixes a windmill before breakfast is a man worth keeping." "That's a low bar," he said. "The bar," Mara said, "was already on the ground when you got here." She was aware of the distance between them. Not large, but specific, The particular distance of two people who have been circling something for long enough that they both know what it is and are both waiting for whoever is going to be the one to close the distance to do it. I'm not easy, she said. I want to say that plainly. I have strong opinions about how this ranch is run, and I don't negotiate on most of them. I work hard, and I expect other people to work hard, and I don't have a lot of patience for people who don't say what they mean. She held his gaze. And I was told I can't have children, which I've made my peace with mostly, but it's a fact about my life, and I'm not going to— Mara, he said, I'm not finished. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm just telling you that I've been listening since the day I got here, and nothing you've said is news to me, and none of it changed anything I thought about being here. She looked at him. That's a very tidy answer, she said. It's the true one, he said. What about children? He was quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet, the pause of a man giving the question its full weight rather than answering past it. I lost my family, he said. Not the way you mean, not the same thing. But I know what it is to believe that the shape of your future is fixed and unmovable. He looked at her. I don't think it is. I think the shape of the future is made of decisions, and I'd rather make mine beside you than spend the next 5 years going somewhere else. The barn was quiet around them. The horses shifted. The lamp threw its small, steady light across the straw, and the tools and the two people standing in it. All right, she said. All right, he said. It was, perhaps, the least dramatic conclusion to a conversation that had been building for 2 months, but it was true to both of them, to the woman who said what she meant and didn't embroider it, and to the man who had spent 5 years learning that the most important things were usually also the most plain. He crossed the distance. She let him. The charges against Silas Braddock were filed in federal court the following month, and the trial, when it came, was not quick. These things rarely are. And the machinery of federal justice moves according to its own schedule, which has nothing to do with the urgency of the people waiting on its outcome. But it moved. Shaw was thorough, and the documents from the safe were thorough, and Garrick Vale's testimony was detailed and specific in the way that testimony is when the person giving it has been preparing it in their conscience for 3 years. 3 other former associates of Braddock's came forward once the protection of his power was visibly withdrawn, because that is how it often works. The silence holds until the silence is no longer the safer option, and then people talk. Coalfield the banker lost his position and faced separate charges for his role in the debt manipulation that had targeted several families in the valley, including, the federal record eventually noted, the estate of one Thomas Veyne, deceased, whose daughter's original debt burden was subsequently recalculated by a court that had no patience for what the recalculation revealed. Sheriff Gaines pled out early. He received the lightest sentence of anyone involved, which was its own kind of commentary on what the law values when it's deciding who cooperated most usefully, but Mara decided not to spend energy being angry about it because she had other things to spend energy on. Cutter disappeared. This was perhaps the most unsatisfying part of the whole resolution. Vern Cutter, who had ridden into her yard with his practiced pleasantness and his veiled threats, and who had given the order at the Pollard barn, was not found when Shaw's men went looking. He had left the territory sometime in the 48 hours between Mara riding for Denver and the federal warrants being served. Rhett, when he heard this, went quiet in a specific way that Mara recognized as the processing of an outcome he didn't like but was going to make his peace with. He'll surface somewhere, Rhett said. Maybe, she said. And when he does, there's a federal warrant with his name on it. Yes, she said. He nodded, and she watched him do the work of accepting that not everything resolves cleanly, that some things trail off rather than conclude, and that the trade, Braddock finished, the ranch secure, 5 years of following finally having somewhere to land, was worth the incompleteness of the Cutter thread. Not everything wraps up. Sometimes you have to live alongside the parts that don't. Braddock was convicted on 11 counts. The sentence was long enough to be a life sentence for a man his age, and both Rhett and Mara heard the verdict in a letter from Shaw rather than in person, because they were at Veyne Creek when it came and had decided not to go to Denver for the sentencing, a decision that surprised some people who expected them to want to see it in person. Mara's reasoning, which she explained to Pete when he asked, was simple. I watched him be taken out of his own house, she said. That was enough. Pete considered this. I'd have wanted to see more, he said. I know, she said. That's a difference between us. It was not a criticism. It was just true, and Mara had stopped avoiding true things even when they were complicated. The ranch work continued because ranch work doesn't stop for legal proceedings or personal revelations or any of the other things that occupy the human part of a working life. The North Pasture secondary feed got cleared, and it took 2.5 days, and Pete helped with his damaged shoulder and complained about his damaged shoulder with enough creativity that Rhett told him once that he should consider a second career in drama. And Pete said he'd consider it when his shoulder healed, which, as Mara had predicted, became the standard response to any request for physical effort for the better part of 6 months. New hands came on. 3 of them, 2 young men from farm families east of Cinder Hollow who needed work, and who came with the modest, prove-it attitude of people who aren't sure yet if they're wanted, and one older man named Duarte who had worked cattle in Texas and had come north for reasons he was not specific about, but who turned out to be one of the most skilled ropers Rhett had ever seen, which was enough of a qualification to make everything else secondary. Rhett paid them fair wages, which he discussed with Mara first, and which she agreed on without negotiation because they were fair wages, and she was not going to be the kind of employer who haggles against fairness. They married in October in Cinder Hollow, on a day that was cold enough to see your breath but clear enough to see the mountains, which the locals said was the best kind of day the valley had to offer, and which Mara thought was probably right. The ceremony was simple, because neither of them was the kind of person who needed ceremony to be complicated, and the celebration afterward at the ranch was louder and longer and more populated than the ceremony, because Cinder Hollow had a great deal of accumulated relief to release, and a wedding is as good a reason as any to release it. Ellis Marsh brought good coffee, the expensive kind, which he served freely and without comment, and which was the closest thing to an apology he was ever going to make in public, and Mara accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. Clara wept, which she had done at every significant event in Cinder Hollow for 30 years, and which everyone had long since learned to treat as background weather. Pete Garfield danced badly and enthusiastically, and did not mention his shoulder once. Garrick Vale came. He stood at the edge of things most of the evening, a man still learning how to occupy a room after the specific kind of reckoning he'd been through, and Mara went to him at one point and stood beside him for a moment without requiring anything of him. And he said, "I'm glad it came right," and she said, "It came right enough." And they stood together in the not-quite silence of a celebration around them, and left it at that. Rhett's mother came from New Mexico. This was the thing Mara had not known about, and it was the thing that undid her composure more than anything else in the day. Not the ceremony, or the people, or even the particular quality of the afternoon light on the mountains, but the moment when an older woman stepped out of a wagon in the yard, and Rhett went still in the specific way he went still when something hit him at a level below his prepared responses. And the woman looked at him, and he looked at her, and they crossed the yard to each other with the particular urgency of 2 people who have been a long time apart and are not wasting another moment on the distance. Mara had not seen Rhett cry before that day. She did not see him cry then, exactly. But she saw what it looked like when a man stood with his mother in the yard of a ranch he had helped save, and felt, for the first time in 5 years, that the specific emptiness where his family had been was not the whole story. She gave them time. Then his mother came to find Mara, and she was a small woman with sharp eyes and the kind of directness that Mara immediately recognized as the origin of certain qualities she'd been living alongside. And she looked at Mara for a long moment and said, "He wrote me about you, a month ago. He said," "You know what he said?" "No," Mara said. "He said, I found somewhere that felt like it was supposed to be mine." The older woman's eyes were serious. "He hasn't said anything like that since before Colorado." Mara didn't say anything because she didn't trust what would come out. "Take care of him," Rhett's mother said. "He's very capable of taking care of himself," Mara said. "I know that," his mother said. "I'm not asking you to carry him. I'm asking you to stay in the same place. That's what he needs. I need someone who stays." Mara thought about the morning she'd ridden out to Denver with the canvas bag, and about what it had felt like to leave, and about how much of the 3-day ride had been conducted with a portion of her attention permanently pointed backward. "I'm staying," she said. The years that followed were not seamless. The ranch had good seasons and difficult ones, and there were dry summers when the creek dropped and the pasture went thin, and the numbers in the ledger required the kind of creative accounting that her father had been bad at, and Mara had gotten considerably better at by necessity. There were disagreements between her and Rhett that were genuine and occasionally loud, and once involved a fence line dispute with a neighboring property that took 3 months to resolve and that they both later acknowledged had been more about exhaustion than the fence. There were hands who didn't work out and had to be let go, which Mara found harder than she expected every time, and there were seasons when the cattle prices were so low that the fair wages felt like a luxury she was barely maintaining. But the windmill kept turning, and the creek kept running, and the ranch that everyone had believed she would lose became, over the years, one of the more respected operations in the valley. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but the kind of place that people pointed to when they talked about what it looked like to do things honestly, to pay fair, to treat the land and the people on it like they both mattered. Cinder Hollow changed more slowly than individual ranches do, because towns are more stubborn than people, but it changed. New leadership came in through elections that were now actually contested, which sounds obvious but had not been the case for 2 decades. Coalfield's replacement at the bank was a younger man from outside the valley who had no existing loyalties and a professional interest in not acquiring any. Businesses that had been operating under Braddock's informal tax of protection and accommodation discovered that life without it was cheaper in every sense. The Pollard family's daughter came back to the valley 4 years after the verdict, looking at the land that had been her father's, and Mara helped her identify which parcels had been resold legitimately and which were still in the legal tangle that the federal fraud case had created. And she introduced her to a lawyer in Denver who had made something of a specialty of exactly these situations. She did this because it needed doing, and because she had the knowledge to help, and because Tom Pollard had bought his coffee from Ellis Marsh every Wednesday and had been right that it was overpriced and had died from the weight of a wrong that should not have gone unaddressed, and addressing it, even years later and imperfectly, mattered. She did not receive thanks for it that equaled the effort. She did not expect to. Rhett's brother came out from wherever the cattle drives had taken him, eventually, and spent a season at Veyne Creek, and was a capable hand and a difficult house guest in the way of a younger brother who has spent years operating without the social friction of close quarters. And Mara tolerated him with the specific combination of patience and bluntness that she brought to most things. And he left in the spring with the kind of gratitude that men who find it hard to express gratitude express indirectly by being slightly less difficult than they could have been. Rhett's mother visited every fall. There was an afternoon, years into all of this, enough years that the children who had been young in the valley when Braddock was taken away were now grown and starting their own families. Enough years that the scorched fence post had been replaced twice over, and the exact location of the original fire was something only the people who had been there could point to. When Mara was standing at the creek diversion watching the water move through the channel her father had built, and that she and Rhett had cleared, and that the seasons had kept requiring attention and care in the way that all useful things require attention and care, and she was thinking about nothing in particular, just watching the water move, when she became aware that she was content. Not happy, exactly. Happiness is a more specific and temporary thing, a weather condition rather than a climate. Content was different. Content was the feeling of standing in a place that had been fought for and held and built up patiently, in a life that had been lived the way she'd intended to live it, even when that intention required more than she'd known she had. She thought about her father who had built this channel with his hands. She thought about the morning she had stood in his study and heard a room full of men laugh at her, and about the 5 words that had come through a door and changed the direction of everything. She thought about the particular way courage works, not as a single dramatic act, but as a series of small decisions, each one a little harder than the previous, each one made with incomplete information and no guarantee, each one adding to a direction that only becomes visible when you look back at the accumulation of them. She had been afraid on every day of this. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had been afraid the morning she'd said no in her uncle's study, and afraid the morning she'd decided to trust a stranger with barn floor and beans, and afraid the night she'd climbed through a window at Blackthorn Range with her hands shaking, and afraid the entire 3-day ride to Denver with the evidence of a man's crimes across her saddle. The fear had not gone away on any of those mornings. She had just decided each time that the fear was not the most important thing present. Rhett came across the pasture toward her, the way he often did at this hour, moving in the unhurried way of a man who has been working steadily all day and is now done working and is moving toward something he wants to move toward. He had gray in his hair now, the kind that comes in at the temples first, and that she had watched arrive over the years with a feeling she couldn't quite name, something between tenderness and the particular ache of time passing, which was not sadness, but was adjacent to it. He stood beside her and looked at the water. Duarte says the North herd is up 20 from last month, he said. Good, she said. Walsh's boy, the younger one, he wants to talk about a contract for the spring drive. I'll talk to him, she said. They were quiet for a moment, looking at the water together. I was thinking, she said, about the day my uncle handed me to you. He looked at her sideways. As a joke, he said. As a joke, she said. He looked back at the water. The corner of his mouth moved. Funniest thing he ever did, Rhett said. She almost laughed again. The same surprised, genuine almost laughter she'd felt in the barn years ago, the kind that kept catching her off guard because she had not expected this man, of all the things she had not expected, to be consistently, quietly, funny. He thought he was getting rid of a problem, she said. He was, Rhett said. His problem. She looked at the creek. She looked at the windmill turning on the horizon. She looked at the man standing beside her who had walked through a door 5 years and many years ago and said 5 words that were not, as it turned out, the end of anything. They were the beginning. Not a clean beginning, not an easy one, not the kind that looks like a beginning when you're standing in it, because beginnings never do. They look like whatever the day requires, a repaired windmill, a cleared fence line, a decision made with shaking hands, a canvas bag heavy with someone else's crimes, a town deciding that fear had cost enough. They look like the work that needs doing. And then one day you stand at the creek that your father built, and the man you love stands beside you, and the water moves the way it's supposed to move, and you understand that you are not in the beginning anymore. You are in the thing itself, the life itself, the one you held on to when everyone said to let go. Veyne Creek ran clear into the evening, and the windmill turned, and the mountains held the last light longer than the valley did, and Mara Veyne, Mara Calder, and both names were true, and both were hers, stood in the place she had refused to surrender and felt the full weight of what refusing had built. It was considerable. It was enough. It was home.